Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1: The Black Death and the Collapse of Everyday Life. The year was 1347. You are living in a small, muddy town on the edge of a bustling European trade route. Life is difficult, predictable, and mostly monotonous. You wake each morning to the same sounds: the crowing of roosters, the bleating of goats, the distant hammering of a blacksmith shaping iron for carts and plows. Your work is constant, repetitive, and exhausting, tending animals, baking bread, hauling water from the town well. The sky is gray more often than it is blue, and the smell of unwashed streets hangs heavy in the air. Life is ordinary, and in its ordinary rhythm there is safety, routine, and a sense of control. But this fragile equilibrium is about to shatter. Merchants from the east arrive with strange tales of disease. Ships, once eagerly anticipated for trade, now bring whispers of black boils, fever, and sudden death. You hear them say it is a sickness unlike any seen before, a pestilence that does not spare the rich or the poor. At first, these stories seem distant, almost like rumors. You think, our town is small, we are careful, we will be fine. You are not fine. Within weeks, the first signs appear. A neighbor falls ill, complaining of a burning fever and swollen lumps under the arm and groin. Soon, the telltale black spots appear on his skin. His body, once sturdy and familiar, begins to decay before your eyes. The local healer is helpless. The apothecaries, remedies, herbs, poultices, prayers do nothing. Panic seeps into your town as more and more people succumb. Families are torn apart. Some try to flee, but the plague spreads along roads and rivers faster than any horse can run. The Black Death, as it would later be called, was not a single disease but a combination of bubonic and pneumonic plague, carried by fleas on rats that traveled aboard merchant ships. Scientists today know it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, but in 1347, nobody had microscopes or knowledge of bacteria. People attributed it to divine punishment, bad air, or even the alignment of the planets. You hear priests preaching fire and brimstone sermons, urging confession and penance. Others turn to scapegoating: strangers, foreigners, or even neighbors accused of poisoning wells. The social fabric that had been built over generations begins to unravel. Life during this period is surreal. Streets are filled with the stench of decay as bodies are left where they fall. Mass graves are dug hastily outside town walls, and priests sometimes abandon their posts, unwilling or unable to offer last rites. The normal routines, market days, weddings, harvest work collapse under the weight of fear and death. Food rots in the fields because there are no hands to harvest it. Children are orphaned, elderly abandoned, and survivors are left to navigate a world that feels suddenly unfamiliar and hostile. You try to understand the rules of survival. Hygiene is rudimentary. People wash when they can, but clean water is scarce and latrines often overflow. You avoid contact with the sick, but the disease is invisible. There is no warning before it strikes. You notice the patterns. The disease moves along trade routes, strikes hardest in crowded towns, but spares no one entirely. Even the nobility and royalty are vulnerable. Entire courts are wiped out in weeks. In Florence, nearly half the population dies. In London, corpses lie unburied in the streets. Survival is as much about luck as anything else. As the plague spreads, social norms are upended. Labor becomes scarce, giving peasants new leverage over their lords, though this is a small comfort amid the tragedy. The economy falters. Mills close, markets shrink, and coinage becomes scarce. Those who survive often inherit wealth unexpectedly, but they inherit it in a world of fear, grief, and uncertainty. Families who once lived together are fragmented. Communities that once thrived are hollowed out. In this context, even the smallest choices feel monumental. Do you risk tending to a sick relative, knowing you might contract the disease? Do you flee town, leaving behind everything familiar? How do you maintain hope when death seems to follow you through every alleyway, every doorway, every breath. The plague also brings unexpected consequences. Some towns implement early forms of quarantine. Travelers from infected areas are restricted or forcibly isolated. Public health measures, crude as they are, begin to emerge not out of knowledge of bacteria, but out of desperate observation. And yet, even these precautions often fail. The Black Death moves faster than understanding, faster than human intervention. By the end of the first year, the population has been decimated. Entire families vanish, leaving homes abandoned, livestock unattended. Nature creeps back into spaces humans once dominated. Fields lie fallow, forests reclaim villages. The sheer scale of mortality challenges your understanding of life. What does it mean to live when so many die around you? How can ordinary people maintain faith, work, and hope when the very foundations of society crumble? And yet, amid the despair, there are flickers of resilience. Some communities reorganize. Survivors develop coping mechanisms, stricter hygiene, avoidance of public gatherings, and rudimentary record-keeping of who is ill. You witness acts of compassion, however small, a neighbor leaving bread at a door, a healer trying, even if futilely, to care for the afflicted. Human adaptability surfaces in subtle, almost invisible ways. The Black Death is not a story of heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story of endurance, observation, and the fragile persistence of ordinary life in the face of relentless mortality. It reshapes towns, economies, religions, and social structures. It is both terrifying and transformative. And here, you are left standing amid the remnants of your town, uncertain who will survive the next week, the next day, or the next hour. You begin to wonder, as the disease continues its relentless march, will the world ever return to the familiar rhythm of daily life, or has everything been irreversibly changed? By the second year of the Black Death, the rhythm of your life has been completely altered. The streets that once bustled with merchants, craftsmen, and children are eerily silent. The soundscape of your town, previously filled with clanging hammers, barking dogs, and the distant call of bell towers, now carries an undertone of emptiness. Sometimes, you think you can hear ghosts of ordinary routines, echoes of a life that no longer exists. You navigate your days carefully, measuring every step, every breath, aware that death could strike without warning. Survival strategies evolve out of necessity. You begin to notice patterns among those who remain healthy. People avoid crowded marketplaces. Food is grown in small backyard plots to reduce the need for travel. Houses are ventilated, and personal hygiene, once a minor concern, becomes a ritual of survival. Families that survive learn to isolate the sick, not always out of cruelty, but because instinct tells them it is the only way to prevent more loss. At the same time, fear manifests in social behavior. Many turn to superstition. You hear rumors of poisoned wells, wandering strangers, and mysterious omens in the sky. Religious fervor spikes. Processions through towns become both ritual and spectacle, prayers and chanting offered to stave off divine wrath. Pilgrimages increase as people hope that holy relics or sacred sites will offer protection. But you also notice darker impulses. Jews, foreigners, and marginalized neighbors are accused of causing the plague, leading to violence, expulsions, and massacres in places like Strasbourg and Mainz. The human mind, desperate for control in the face of inexplicable death, often targets the vulnerable. Economically, the plague shakes the foundation of medieval society. With death reducing the labor force by as much as a third or more in some regions, fields go unplowed, mills idle, and craft production stalls. But this devastation brings unexpected shifts. Survivors find themselves in higher demand. Peasants, once bound by rigid feudal obligations, begin to negotiate better terms with their lords. Wages rise in towns and countryside alike. Suddenly, the balance of power shifts ever so slightly in favor of ordinary people, though this is hardly a comfort when the shadow of death looms overhead. You might find yourself taking over work that you never imagined doing, learning trades or skills out of sheer necessity. Some adapt quickly, discovering unexpected resilience and ingenuity. Others collapse under the weight of grief, wandering empty streets in despair. Families are forced to reorganize. Orphans are taken in by distant relatives or strangers. Widows inherit land and responsibilities that were previously unthinkable. You begin to see the seeds of social change, growing quietly in the ashes of the old order. Even daily routines are punctuated by death. The local cemetery becomes a macabre center of life, a place where business, news, and observation intersect. You see the speed with which the plague consumes bodies days, sometimes hours, from fever to rigor mortis. You notice the improvisational methods used to dispose of corpses: mass graves, pyres, shallow pits. The scale is staggering, and it forces you to confront mortality constantly. This proximity to death reshapes your perception of life. Simple things: a warm meal, a dry bed, a healthy child become miracles. The plague's impact on medicine and knowledge is paradoxical. On one hand, traditional healers and physicians are powerless, their remedies ineffective against a bacterium they cannot see. On the other, survivors begin observing symptoms, mapping the disease's progress, and experimenting with quarantine methods. Venice, for example, establishes early forms of enforced isolation, monitoring incoming ships and restricting travel. Though primitive by modern standards, these measures demonstrate an emergent understanding that human intervention, however limited, can influence survival. You witness these tentative steps toward public health, small victories in a world dominated by uncertainty. Religion, too, is transformed. Clergy who survive are often exhausted, traumatized, or disillusioned. You notice that sermons become more pragmatic, focusing on charity, community, and care for the sick, rather than abstract punishment. Pilgrimages and relic veneration continue, but the church faces a crisis of authority. How can it explain why God allows death to claim so many so indiscriminately? Some turn away entirely, abandoning prayer in despair, while others double down, seeking comfort in ritual. Amid all this, cultural life changes in subtle ways. Art and literature begin to reflect mortality more openly. Visual depictions of skeletons, corpses, and plague scenes emerge, illustrating a society grappling with its own fragility. Music, previously celebratory or courtly, incorporates dirges and somber tones. Storytelling shifts from heroic tales to cautionary narratives emphasizing endurance, community, and observation. You may not realize it, but even the boring details of survival, how to cultivate a garden in quarantine, how to care for the sick without becoming ill yourself, become critical knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor. Yet the psychological toll is immense. You wake to find neighbors gone, perhaps the last remnants of entire families vanished overnight. The silence of the streets is oppressive. The smells of decay linger for weeks, sometimes months, in corners and alleyways. You wonder if the world you knew, the predictable routines, the social structures, the comforting rituals, will ever return. People begin to develop superstitious coping mechanisms, charms, amulets, and rituals intended to repel the disease. Rational thought coexists uneasily with fear. Every cough, every blackened boil, every sudden death feels like an omen. Through this, humanity's capacity to adapt shines faintly. People learn to ration resources, to care for one another when possible, and to navigate life in a landscape dominated by uncertainty. Social hierarchies are temporarily blurred. A laborer might suddenly find himself responsible for managing land or overseeing a harvest, while nobles who survive may face unexpected dependence on commoners. These shifts, born out of catastrophe, hint at the long-term transformations that the Black Death will precipitate in European society. By the third year, you see the beginning of recovery, but the plague remains a looming presence. The mortality rates have decreased, but the trauma is far from over. Families are fractured, towns are depopulated, and economies are destabilized. You start to notice a world subtly transformed. Land ownership patterns have shifted, wages have increased for survivors, and cultural attitudes toward mortality, wealth, and religion are slowly changing. Yet questions linger. How long will these changes last? Will society fully recover, or has the world irrevocably altered under the weight of loss? How will those who survived carry this trauma into the decades ahead? And so, as you navigate this new reality, you are left wondering, what happens to a society after it loses nearly half of its people? Can human resilience alone rebuild towns, economies, and communities that were so thoroughly shattered? Or does such a cataclysm leave a permanent mark on the course of history? By the fourth year after the initial wave of the Black Death, the world around you looks eerily familiar yet profoundly changed. The streets of your town are no longer entirely empty, but the rhythm of life is slower, tentative, and cautious. Children play where corpses once lay and markets reopen, though they are smaller, quieter, and less crowded. You notice the subtle shifts. Houses abandoned during the peak of the plague have been claimed by survivors, livestock has been redistributed, and the landscape itself has altered, with fields left fallow for years now gradually returning to cultivation. Life persists, but it is forever marked by the memory of death. The demographic shift is staggering. Across Europe, estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 30% and 60% of the population in some regions. Entire villages vanished, their names lost to memory, leaving behind crumbling stone foundations and overgrown fields. You, among the living, inherit the legacy of those who died: land, homes, possessions, but also grief, fear, and trauma. The sudden scarcity of labor reshapes your world. Lords and landowners, previously accustomed to exploiting a vast workforce, must now negotiate with peasants to secure harvests and maintain estates. This shift introduces a slow erosion of the rigid feudal system. You notice it in small ways: a worker demanding fair payment, a serf buying freedom, a widow managing land that would have belonged to her husband. These are subtle changes, almost imperceptible day by day, but they hint at a transformation in social structures that will ripple for generations. The economy, once stagnant, begins to recover but in altered form. Wages rise due to labor shortages, towns experience a slow revival, and trade routes reopen, though cautiously. Some merchants prosper, adapting to the new reality, while others fail entirely, their businesses obliterated by the collapse in population. You observe that the Black Death acts as a force of economic and social recalibration. It destroys old hierarchies, reassigns wealth, and redistributes labor in ways no one could have predicted. Ordinary people like you find new opportunities, though they are inextricably linked with grief and loss. The cultural impact is profound as well. Art, literature, and music now grapple openly with mortality and human vulnerability. You might notice the rise of macabre imagery, dance macabre scenes depicting skeletons leading the living to the grave, or literature filled with reflections on the fragility of life. These expressions are not simply for entertainment, they are a collective attempt to process trauma and understand the scale of human mortality. Religion, too, adapts. The church, once seen as a pillar of unassailable authority, faces questions it cannot fully answer. Why did God allow so many to die? How can faith endure when the familiar structures of life are shattered? Some people cling more tightly to devotion, while others drift away, skeptical of a divine plan that seems so indifferent to suffering. Daily life, though it resumes, is forever altered. Families are smaller, towns more cautious, and survival skills more refined. People remember the lessons of the plague: hygiene, isolation during sickness, observation of symptoms, and rudimentary public health measures. You notice that certain superstitions persist, but practical knowledge begins to accumulate, laying the groundwork for early epidemiology centuries later. Even in your ordinary routines, gardening, cooking, tending animals, there is a consciousness of risk, a new awareness of the invisible threats that shaped your childhood and adulthood alike. Yet perhaps the most enduring impact is psychological. You and those around you carry trauma like invisible wounds: fear of sudden illness, the grief of lost loved ones, and the awareness of death's unpredictability shape your behavior and outlook. Some become more cautious, secretive, or superstitious. Others find resilience and determination in the face of adversity. Communities that survive do so not just through labor or resourcefulness, but through adaptation, mutual aid, and shared memory. You realize that survival is never merely individual, it is collective. The bonds between neighbors, family members, and communities determine who thrives and who collapses under pressure. The Black Death also leaves a long shadow over future generations. You may live to see decades later that the social and economic shifts it initiated create opportunities for upward mobility previously impossible for ordinary people. Peasants gain more negotiating power, towns acquire autonomy, and labor shortages accelerate technological and agricultural innovation. In some ways, the world is rebuilt stronger and more adaptable. Yet this rebuilding is slow, uneven, and often accompanied by lingering fear. The trauma is inherited, passed down in cautionary stories and cautious habits. And as you reflect on the experience, you begin to see the paradox of the Black Death. It is terrifying, destructive, and utterly indiscriminate, yet it also catalyzes profound transformation. The horror of living through it teaches lessons in resilience, observation, and adaptation. You understand, perhaps for the first time, how ordinary lives simply surviving day to day intersect with massive historical forces, shaping the trajectory of entire societies. You realize that history is not only written by kings and battles, but also by the quiet endurance of people like yourself, navigating unspeakable calamity. Finally, as the years pass, you wonder, how would the world have developed if the Black Death had never struck? Would social hierarchies have remained rigid for centuries longer? Would technological and agricultural innovation have been slower without the pressures created by labor scarcity? And on a personal level, you continue to ask yourself, how much of your own life is shaped by forces beyond your control, and how much is determined by your quiet decisions to adapt, survive, and endure? The plague recedes, leaving a world scarred, changed, but undeniably alive. And you, an ordinary person in an extraordinary historical moment, carry the memory of horror, loss, and resilience into the centuries that follow, reminding future generations that even in the most terrifying times, human endurance persists. Story 2: When Peasants Revolted. The Jacquerie of 1358. It is the spring of 1358, and you are a peasant in northern France. Your life is one of routine, repetition, and hard labor, punctuated by seasonal rhythms that dictate sowing, harvesting, and tending livestock. You rise before dawn, your hands roughened by constant toil, your clothes patched repeatedly to last another season. The world you inhabit is governed by obligations, to your lord, to the local church, and to the land that sustains you. Every day is predictable, and in that predictability, there is a sense of security, even if that security is fragile. Yet the stability of your life has been severely undermined. You survived the Black Death, but the world you knew did not survive with you. Nearly half the population of France has perished, leaving fields untended, villages depopulated, and labor in desperate demand. On paper, this should be good news. With fewer people to work the land, wages have risen, and laborers can demand slightly better conditions. In practice, however, the nobility resists these changes. Lords, desperate to maintain their power and income, impose harsh taxes, demand feudal obligations, and punish peasants who dare to assert newfound rights. You notice that resentment is growing among the peasantry. Conversations in the village center, at the well, or during shared labor are filled with stories of injustice. A neighbor tells you how he was fined for not delivering enough grain, even though he had worked sunup to sundown in fields half overgrown from lack of labor. Another recounts the murder of a peasant caught stealing firewood, punished far more severely than any lord would tolerate for his own servants. Daily life, once hard but manageable, now feels unbearable under the weight of oppression and the lingering fear of famine, disease, and arbitrary violence. France is not the same country it was before the plague. The monarchy is weak, the nobility divided, and the peasantry embittered. A war with England the ongoing 100 years. War has drained resources, devastated towns, and left a trail of destruction across the countryside. Villages have been burned, livestock stolen, and roads patrolled by bands of mercenaries who care little for human life. You see soldiers quartered in your village, taking food, women, and livestock as though the land belongs to them. The peasants whisper names in anger, nobles who live in comfort, merchants who exploit scarcity, clergy who preach charity but accept tithes without mercy. In this tense environment, rumors spread quickly. You hear stories of uprisings in other regions, peasants striking against unfair taxes or lords' abuses. You hear about small bands of rebels organizing in secret, meeting at night in woods or abandoned farmhouses, sharing grievances and plotting ways to reclaim dignity and safety. These whispers are dangerous. Discovery could mean execution, but the desperation in your village makes silence increasingly impossible. People feel trapped, live under crushing oppression, or risk everything for a chance at freedom. Your life has become a calculus of survival, calculation, and moral compromise. You plant and harvest, repair fences, and care for animals, all the while counting the cost of defiance. Every action is weighed against the consequences. Will leaving your post risk punishment? Will complaining about unfair taxes invite violence? The world seems both familiar and alien. Fields, homes, and roads remain the same, but social structures are collapsing around you. The ordinary patterns of life are infused with tension, fear, and anticipation. Food is scarce and expensive. You remember the harsh winters and poor harvests of recent years. Grain is hoarded by the few who have it. Bread, once abundant, is now a luxury. Famine lurks behind every mismanaged harvest, and you worry that another bad season could kill as surely as the plague did. Livestock theft and banditry have become routine. No one is entirely safe, and survival depends on vigilance, cunning, and occasionally brute force. The church continues to provide guidance, but even religious authority is shaken. Priests encourage submission and obedience, preaching that the social hierarchy is ordained by God. Yet you witness clergy who exploit the poor, collecting tithes while ignoring starvation in their parishes. Faith, once a source of comfort, is now mixed with anger, resentment, and doubt. You wonder whether divine providence truly protects the meek or whether survival depends solely on human action. Then, quietly, word arrives that rebellion is stirring. Peasants in nearby regions have begun organizing against the nobility, attacking castles, looting granaries, and seizing goods. The movement is called the Jacquerie, a name whispered with both hope and fear. Jacques is the generic term the upper class uses for peasants, mocking them even as the rebellion spreads. Yet the peasants embrace it as a banner of identity, a symbol that ordinary people, long treated as invisible laborers, are asserting themselves. You feel a mix of fear and curiosity. Could this uprising change your life, or will it be crushed before it begins? The stories of violent reprisals are enough to make even the most desperate hesitate, but the desperation is palpable. Generations of abuse, compounded by plague, war, and famine, have created a combustible mix of anger, courage, and despair. The Jacquerie is not just a political movement, it is the expression of human endurance and frustration, a statement that even the most ordinary people have limits to what they can endure. In the weeks that follow, the village begins to murmur with clandestine meetings. Farmers, laborers, and tradesmen discuss strategy, loyalty, and survival. Some advocate for negotiation, others for outright revolt. Weapons are crude, farm tools, hunting knives, and whatever can be wielded in desperation. There is no guarantee of success. News of previous failed uprisings and the formidable power of the nobility hangs over every decision. Yet for the first time in memory, you feel that action, however risky, might provide agency, even if it comes at the cost of safety. As the first sparks of rebellion ignite, you face a personal dilemma. Will you remain a passive observer, clinging to the routines that have sustained you, Or will you take part in the uprising that promises both potential freedom and almost certain danger? The answer is not clear, and the consequences will echo for years to come. The world you knew, the world of predictable labor, survival, and feudal obligation, is about to be irrevocably shaken. And so, as spring turns to summer, you stand at the threshold of history, wondering, can ordinary people, armed with little more than desperation and courage, challenge centuries of entrenched power, or will their efforts be extinguished before they truly ignite? By early June of 1358, the tension that has simmered for months erupts across northern France. You, a peasant who has spent your life toiling under the yoke of feudal obligations, now find yourself in the midst of something unprecedented. Rumors of rebellion have become reality. Small bands of peasants are gathering, coordinating attacks, and challenging the nobility directly. The Jacquerie, initially dismissed by lords as a minor nuisance, spreads like wildfire across the countryside, fueled by anger, desperation, and the memory of recent suffering from famine, plague, and war. You witness the first signs of revolt in your own village. Men armed with axes, pitchforks, and makeshift clubs gather in secret, exchanging whispered plans under the cover of night. Women, children, and the elderly watch from doorways, some offering food or information, others paralyzed with fear. The air is thick with tension. The familiar landscape, fields, barns, roads, is transformed into a theater of potential violence. Every sound, every movement could signal an attack or a warning. The ordinary routines of life, plowing, tending animals, fetching water, are disrupted as survival and preparation take precedence. The targets of the rebellion are clear. Lords who have demanded excessive taxes, hoarded grain, or imposed brutal punishments for minor infractions find their estates under threat. Manor houses are stormed, barns are looted, livestock seized or slaughtered. In some villages, peasants set fire to records and rolls that detail obligations, effectively erasing decades of feudal claims. The revolt is chaotic and uneven, driven less by strategic military planning than by collective rage. You notice the mix of emotions in the participants: fear, exhilaration, vengeance, and grim determination. The energy is raw, primal, and dangerous for both the rebels and the nobility. Yet the peasants' power is limited. They are largely untrained, poorly armed, and lack coordination. You witness skirmishes where a group of angry villagers manages to repel a small detachment of soldiers, but is crushed when reinforcements arrive. The scale of violence is small compared to battles between armies, yet the impact on local communities is profound. Entire villages are destabilized. Some peasants flee to avoid retaliation, while others double down, spurred by a mixture of courage and desperation. One particularly striking element of the Jacquerie is its indiscriminate nature. The rebels do not target only the tyrannical lords, they sometimes attack anyone associated with power or wealth. Merchants, clergy, and minor officials are vulnerable, creating fear not only among the nobility but also within communities themselves. You notice that rebellion, while motivated by grievances, often blurs into chaos, leaving ordinary villagers unsure of who to trust. Survival becomes a matter of judgment, luck, and the ability to navigate rapidly changing allegiances. The response from the nobility is swift and brutal. Knights and mounted forces descend upon rebellious villages with overwhelming force. You see peasants, many of whom have never held a sword, cut down by professional soldiers. Castles once thought impregnable become symbols of both terror and revenge. Tales spread of massacres following minor skirmishes, reinforcing the dangers of revolt. Yet, in the brief moments of victory when a manor house is seized or a noble driven from a village, you catch glimpses of empowerment that had been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Ordinary people, for the first time in memory, exert influence over the structures that have dominated their lives for generations. Amid the chaos, alliances form and dissolve unpredictably. Some peasants join forces with disenfranchised knights, mercenaries, or wandering soldiers who seek to exploit the unrest. Others attempt to negotiate, sending emissaries to local lords, hoping to reduce taxes or gain temporary reprieve. You witness that success is rarely permanent. Even when concessions are won, the threat of counterattack looms. Communities are forced to adapt constantly, balancing ambition, survival, and fear. The human cost of the Jacquerie is staggering. You see families torn apart, villages destroyed, and the countryside littered with corpses. Survivors carry scars, both physical and psychological, that endure long after the fighting ends. Children witness violence, losing parents or homes, and elders see the destruction of the world they built over decades. Yet even in this horror, there are moments of resilience. Peasants who hide, protect others, or negotiate survival demonstrate resourcefulness and courage under pressure. You begin to understand that history is shaped not only by the victorious, but also by those who endure, adapt, and survive in the face of catastrophe. The rebellion also exposes the limits of power and social hierarchy. The nobility may have wealth, weapons, and organization, but they are not invulnerable. A few hundred peasants, motivated by desperation and rage, can temporarily disrupt feudal authority, destroy property, and challenge norms that have persisted for centuries. This realization spreads quietly among commoners, altering perceptions of their own potential. For the first time, the notion emerges that ordinary people can influence events, even in a rigidly hierarchical society. However, the tide of the Jacquerie is turning. Lacking training, discipline, and long-term strategy, peasant bands begin to fragment under pressure. You notice fear replacing determination as stories of slaughter travel from village to village. Leaders are captured or killed, morale collapses, and communities brace for reprisal. The rebellion, which once seemed like a beacon of potential empowerment, now teeters on the edge of annihilation. The very qualities that gave it initial energy, passion, spontaneity, and anger become vulnerabilities against disciplined military response. And yet the Jacquerie leaves a legacy. Even as the revolt is suppressed with brutal efficiency, the ideas and experiences linger. Ordinary people have tasted collective action, witnessed the fragility of hierarchical power, and experienced both the exhilaration and danger of revolt. You begin to notice subtle shifts in behavior, demands for fairer treatment, greater bargaining power for labor, and cautious experimentation with resistance. The revolt itself may have failed, but it plants seeds for future social transformations. As the chaos settles, you are left with questions that will haunt you for years. Can a society built on rigid hierarchies adapt when its foundations are shaken? How much suffering is required before ordinary people assert agency, even in the face of overwhelming force? And on a personal level, you wonder whether survival in such a violent, unpredictable environment depends more on cunning, courage, or luck. The Jacquerie, like the Black Death before it, reveals the delicate balance between power and vulnerability, stability and chaos, obedience and revolt. The world you thought you understood, peasant, lord, and land alike, is far more precarious than you realized. And in that precariousness lies the essence of human history. Ordinary lives caught in extraordinary circumstances, navigating survival, justice, and resilience with every step. By midsummer of 1358, the initial fire of the Jacquerie begins to dim, not because the peasants have lost their grievances, but because the forces arrayed against them are overwhelming. You, a participant or close observer in this tumultuous uprising, now understand the terrifying reality of confronting entrenched power. Knights, mercenaries, and loyalist peasants, well-armed, trained, and organized, descend upon rebellious villages with ruthless precision. Fields once cleared for planting are now battlegrounds. Barns, granaries, and cottages are burned, leaving blackened skeletons of buildings and shattered livelihoods. The suppression is swift and merciless. Leaders of the revolt are hunted down, tortured, and executed in public displays meant to instill fear. You see friends, neighbors, or distant relatives executed for acts that, days before, were celebrated as courageous resistance. Ordinary peasants who survive the slaughter return to their villages traumatized, wary of any future attempts at collective action. Communities are fractured, social cohesion disrupted, and the countryside bears the scars of violent reprisal for years to come. Yet even in defeat, the Jacquerie leaves an imprint. The revolt demonstrates that the hierarchical system of lords and peasants, rigid as it seems, is not invulnerable. You notice that, after the rebellion, some lords adjust their practices slightly, not out of sympathy, but pragmatism. They may moderate excessive taxes or enforce feudal obligations with more discretion, aware that too much oppression can trigger violence. The revolt has exposed the precarious balance of social order. Authority exists only as long as those beneath it comply, willingly or reluctantly. Life slowly resumes, but everything has changed. Survivors face the daunting task of rebuilding. Fields must be replanted, livestock replaced, and homes reconstructed. You notice a new caution in social interactions. Trust is more carefully measured, and fear is omnipresent. Some peasants choose to flee to cities or less hostile regions, seeking anonymity and protection in urban anonymity. Others cling to the land, determined to endure despite the devastation. Daily routines, once predictable, now exist in the shadow of violence, highlighting the constant tension between survival and autonomy in the medieval world. The psychological impact of the Jacquerie is profound. You carry memories of friends killed in skirmishes, neighbors punished for minor acts of defiance, and the overwhelming sense that survival is fragile. Even those who avoided direct combat are affected by the loss of community and the brutal demonstration of power. The revolt teaches you a harsh lesson. Courage and desperation, while motivating, are not always sufficient to overcome entrenched hierarchies or military advantage. Human resilience is real, but it is often constrained by forces beyond immediate control. Economically, the revolt reinforces some changes initiated by the Black Death. Labor remains scarce, and surviving peasants continue to hold slightly more bargaining power. Some succeed in negotiating better wages or temporary reprieve from feudal obligations. You may notice that towns and villages that experience the revolt adopt subtler forms of resistance, avoiding open confrontation but slowly asserting their agency in less visible ways. Work slowdowns, negotiation, and incremental challenges to authority. In this sense, the Jacquerie plants seeds for social evolution, even if its immediate impact is violently suppressed. Culturally, the memory of the Jacquerie becomes a cautionary tale. Nobility and chroniclers portray the revolt as dangerous, irrational, and chaotic, the folly of the common people, reinforcing social hierarchies in writing and art. Yet among peasants, oral memory preserves a different narrative, one of shared struggle, courage, and the recognition that ordinary lives have limits. Stories are told around hearths of fleeting victories, strategic cunning, and the sacrifices made for dignity. These narratives survive in subtle ways, shaping attitudes and values for generations, influencing how people perceive power, injustice, and possibility. Religion, too, adapts in response to the Jacquerie. Priests and monks emphasize obedience and order, preaching the dangers of revolt, while also acknowledging the suffering that gave rise to the unrest. You may notice that spiritual authority becomes a tool both for moral instruction and social control, guiding the behaviors of peasants and nobility alike. Yet, even within the church, questions linger. How can divine justice coexist with systemic oppression and human suffering? Faith and pragmatism coexist uneasily, reflecting the tension between survival and morality. The Jacquerie also reveals the fragility and adaptability of human societies. Even when crushed, the revolt demonstrates that ordinary people are capable of collective action and innovation in the face of oppression. You see that survival is not just a matter of personal endurance, but also of understanding social dynamics, anticipating retaliation, and making difficult choices between action and caution. Ordinary lives, often overlooked in historical narratives, are deeply entwined with the forces of power, violence, and resilience. As the summer fades, you reflect on the meaning of these events. The Jacquerie did not overturn feudalism, nor did it liberate the peasantry entirely. Yet it exposed vulnerabilities, sparked conversations about fairness, and left lessons that echo through the centuries. The capacity for human resistance, the limits of authority, and the enduring importance of ordinary courage. The revolt underscores that history is shaped not only by kings and battles, but by the collective experiences, suffering, and choices of the common people. You wonder, as you walk the charred remains of your village, what would have happened if the revolt had succeeded? Could France have experienced a dramatic shift in social hierarchy centuries earlier? Would the course of European history laws, taxation, labor, and rights have been altered forever? Or is it the case that rebellion, even when crushed, simply becomes part of a cycle of struggle, teaching lessons in survival, adaptation, and resilience that echo quietly through generations? The Jacquerie ends in failure, but it is far from irrelevant. You carry its memory, its lessons, and its warnings into the future. You understand that ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, are agents of history even when they do not achieve victory. You see that survival, endurance, and quiet adaptability are as powerful as rebellion itself, shaping lives, communities, and society in ways that often go unrecorded yet endure nonetheless. Story 3: Life inside a medieval castle. Hunger, disease, and isolation. You step through the massive wooden gates of a medieval castle, and immediately the world changes. Outside, the countryside stretches in green and brown fields, dotted with peasant villages and grazing livestock. Inside, life is confined to stone walls, narrow corridors, and cramped chambers. You may think of castles as grand, imposing structures, filled with knights, feasts, and luxury, but the reality is far more complex, harsh, and unrelentingly human. Every aspect of life here, from diet to sanitation, is governed by scarcity, hierarchy, and the constant threat of disease or starvation. The castle is divided into spaces according to rank and function. The Great Hall, where the lord and his family dine and conduct business, is the heart of ceremonial life. Its walls are cold in winter, drafty in summer, and echo with the shouts of servants, the clang of utensils, and the heavy footsteps of armed guards. Kitchens are busy places, filled with smoke, fire, and the smell of boiling stews. Yet even here, resources are limited. Meat is preserved through salting or smoking, bread is coarse and often moldy, and vegetables are seasonal at best. Luxury is relative. A rare piece of cheese or a fresh egg is celebrated, but most days consist of monotonous, starchy meals that barely sustain laboring bodies. You notice the stark contrast between the lord's family and the people who serve them. Knights, pages, and servants work tirelessly, carrying heavy loads, cleaning corridors, tending animals, or delivering messages. Their lives are physically demanding, repetitive, and often dangerous. The lord may sit comfortably in the hall, but the survival of the castle depends on the labor, skill, and endurance of those you would scarcely notice in passing. Yet these laborers are also vulnerable. Disease spreads quickly in enclosed spaces, and minor injuries can become life-threatening without proper treatment. Hygiene is a constant concern. The castle is not the sanitized palace you might imagine. Stone walls and wooden floors harbor pests, dirt, and the smells of human waste. Latrines are rudimentary, often located over moats or in small towers, and their contents are rarely removed promptly. Bathing is infrequent, limited by both social norms and the availability of water. In winter, water may freeze. In summer, it may become stagnant. You quickly learn that the proximity of so many people in enclosed spaces makes disease almost inevitable. Fevers, skin infections, and respiratory illnesses spread silently from one room to another. Plague, influenza, or even minor gastrointestinal infections can decimate the lower-ranking inhabitants, while the lord's family may enjoy some protection through isolation and privilege. The castle is also a prison of routine and hierarchy. Every action, from when you eat to where you sleep, is dictated by social status and obligation. Servants rise before dawn to stoke fires, draw water, and prepare meals. Pages practice skills like horsemanship or archery. Knights maintain weapons and armor. Nobility may spend hours in councils or leisure, but even they are constrained by etiquette, security concerns, and the looming possibility of attack. Outside the walls, rival lords, raiding parties, or invading armies remind everyone that the castle's walls, while formidable, are not invincible. Isolation is a constant psychological pressure. You can see the surrounding countryside, but your world is largely confined to stone corridors, courtyards, and towers. Communication with the outside letters, messengers, or brief visits is slow and unreliable. News travels unevenly, often filtered by guards, servants, or the lord's household. You learn about famines, wars, or disease outbreaks weeks or months after they occur. The combination of physical confinement, hierarchical tension, and fear of attack creates an atmosphere of constant vigilance, stress, and uncertainty. Hunger is another hidden companion. While the lord's family enjoys fresh bread, salted meats, and imported delicacies when possible, servants and laborers make do with pottage, small portions of bread, and whatever vegetables are available. During sieges, scarcity becomes acute. You hear stories of lords rationing meat, boiling leather to extract nutrients, or even consuming dogs or cats to survive. Ordinary inhabitants of the castle endure malnutrition, fatigue, and the slow toll of repeated hunger. This scarcity shapes everything from behavior to morale, and it is a reminder that survival within these walls is never guaranteed. Disease and injury are constant threats. A simple cut from a kitchen knife or a scrape while carrying firewood can become fatal if infection sets in. You notice that herbal remedies, poultices, and prayer are the primary forms of treatment. There are no surgeons as we think of them today, and medical knowledge is rudimentary. Mortality is high, even among those who appear healthy and strong. Children born in the castle may survive to adulthood only through a combination of luck, care, and vigilance. Each day, survival depends on attention, endurance, and adaptation to the risks inherent in enclosed, crowded life. You begin to understand that a castle, for all its grandeur, is also a microcosm of medieval society. Hierarchy, labor, survival, and vulnerability are all magnified within the walls. Every person from the lord to the lowest kitchen maid is bound by routines, obligations, and the ever-present risk of hunger, disease, or violence. Ordinary life here is strenuous, monotonous, and unforgiving, but it also fosters resilience. You witness cooperation among servants, ingenuity in rationing food, and quiet heroism in maintaining the castle's operations despite exhaustion and fear. Yet even with these routines and adaptations, you cannot escape the fragility of existence within the castle walls. Winters bring frostbite and illness. Summers bring pests and heat. Contagion spreads quickly. Accidents are frequent. The looming threat of siege, invasion, or sudden disaster reminds everyone that privilege does not guarantee safety, and labor does not guarantee security. Life inside the castle is a constant negotiation between control and vulnerability, comfort and risk. As days turn into weeks, you begin to notice the subtle ways people cope with isolation, scarcity, and hierarchy. Humor, gossip, small rituals, and routines become vital for mental endurance. Celebrations, however modest, mark seasonal changes or the arrival of guests. These small acts of normalcy are lifelines, reminding everyone that human resilience persists even in the most confined and stressful circumstances. And yet, you are left with a persistent question, one that shadows every waking moment. How do people endure months, even years, of confinement, hunger, and disease, while maintaining both their physical and mental strength? What happens to the human spirit in a world where every day is dictated by scarcity, obligation, and the shadow of death? As months pass, you begin to realize that life inside a medieval castle is shaped not only by routine and scarcity, but by sudden crises that can strike without warning. The walls that protect you also isolate you, forcing everyone within to confront dangers collectively. Disease, hunger, and political conflict are constant companions, lurking in corridors, kitchens, and courtyards. Even a small mistake, a poorly stored barrel of grain, a neglected fire, a minor injury can escalate into life-threatening danger. You observe that hierarchy dictates everything, from who eats first to who sleeps nearest the hearth. The Lord's family enjoys the best food, most comfortable quarters, and highest protection, while servants and laborers occupy cold, damp rooms, often sharing space with vermin. Yet hierarchy alone does not guarantee survival. The physical demands of labor, exposure to the elements, and susceptibility to illness affect everyone. Knights may be armored and trained, but they too are vulnerable when disease strikes or food runs scarce. Everyone relies on one another, yet everyone also fears the consequences of failure. Hunger becomes acute during times of siege or poor harvest. You witness situations where supplies are rationed so tightly that malnutrition affects nearly everyone except the Lord and his immediate household. Grain stores are measured meticulously. Meat is boiled into pottage or preserved in salt. Dried herbs supplement meager diets. Even in better times, meals are repetitive and nutritionally insufficient. The monotony of food, combined with uncertainty about tomorrow, gnaws at morale. You learn that the strength to endure comes not only from food itself, but from careful management, shared labor, and psychological resilience. Disease spreads quickly in the enclosed environment. The castle, with its stone walls, narrow staircases, and cramped living quarters, becomes a breeding ground for infection. Fevers, boils, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses move through households silently and indiscriminately. A single infected servant can expose dozens of others. You notice that quarantine is improvised, often consisting of isolating the visibly sick in a separate room or tower. Herbs, prayers, and poultices are applied, though their effectiveness is limited. Every cough or fever inspires fear, as you recognize how quickly minor illness can turn fatal in such conditions. Sieges introduce an entirely different kind of terror. Word arrives that rival lords, mercenaries, or raiders are approaching. The castle's gates are barred, and every inhabitant must assume a role. Knights man the walls, archers take positions on battlements, and laborers carry water, repair walls, and stockpile supplies. You witness the psychological strain of waiting. Tension is constant, fear palpable, and boredom intertwined with anticipation. Days may pass without attack, yet every shadow, every distant horn is a potential threat. Hunger, fatigue, and anxiety compound the danger, testing the limits of endurance for everyone inside. Political intrigue adds another layer of stress. Even inside the walls, alliances, rivalries, and family disputes can determine life or death. Courtiers and advisors maneuver for favor. Disputes over inheritance or taxation ripple down to the servants and laborers, affecting who receives food, protection, or work assignments. You notice that survival requires awareness, tact, and sometimes deception. Every interaction is a small negotiation, a measure of whether you gain favor, avoid punishment, or simply remain unnoticed. Daily life is a constant balancing act between labor, survival, and psychological endurance. You rise before dawn to tend to fires, animals, and kitchens, spend hours carrying water or repairing walls, and eat quickly before the next task begins. Nights bring brief respite but are often punctuated by fear storms, intruders, or illness may strike while you sleep. The monotony of routine masks the constant, underlying danger, creating a rhythm of tension and adaptation that becomes the defining feature of life in the castle. Yet resilience emerges in subtle ways. You notice small communities forming among servants, sharing food, information, and advice for coping with disease and hunger. Knights train and practice together, strengthening bonds that are both practical and emotional. Nobility develops strategies for maintaining morale, hosting modest entertainment, or encouraging ceremonies that reaffirm order. Humor, gossip, and minor rituals become vital psychological tools, keeping spirits alive in the shadow of fear. The castle, for all its grandeur, is also a laboratory for human endurance. You see ingenuity in food preservation, improvisation in medicine, and adaptability in labor. Even children contribute, learning skills quickly, carrying messages, or assisting in kitchens and stables. Every person, no matter their rank, becomes part of a fragile ecosystem, where the survival of the individual depends on cooperation, observation, and sometimes sheer luck. Isolation magnifies every stress. You may go days without leaving the castle, with only courtyards and towers as your world. News from outside is delayed, filtered, or frightening. You hear of famine in neighboring villages, battles between lords, or outbreaks of plague, all of which influence your life indirectly. The castle is at once protective and confining, a paradox that defines the medieval experience. You realize that psychological endurance is as vital as physical strength. Fear, boredom, and uncertainty are constant, yet those who survive find ways to endure through routine, community, and adaptability. As you navigate this world, you begin to wonder, how much of human resilience is learned, and how much is instinctive? How do ordinary people maintain hope and continuity when surrounded by scarcity, danger, and disease? And what long-term impact does living in such an environment have on those who survive, their values, relationships, and understanding of the world beyond the walls? Life in the castle is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is a study in adaptation, endurance, and quiet perseverance, where each small victory, food preserved, illness survived, wall repaired, becomes a monumental achievement in survival. You begin to understand that history is shaped not only by battles and kings, but by these invisible struggles of ordinary people, living, suffering, and persevering behind stone walls. Years pass, and the castle continues to function as both fortress and home, a place where the routines, dangers, and adaptations of medieval life have become ingrained. You, now more accustomed to the rhythms of castle life, notice how survival depends on both physical endurance and mental resilience. Each meal, each chore, each interaction carries significance, shaping the well-being of individuals and the community as a whole. The castle, with its walls, towers, and battlements, is more than architecture. It is a vessel for human adaptation, a microcosm of medieval society where hierarchy, labor, and endurance converge. Recovery from crises, whether disease, famine, or siege, is a slow and deliberate process. After outbreaks of illness, rooms are cleaned, bedding replaced, and food stores replenished. Injuries are tended to, however crudely, and labor reorganized to ensure essential functions continue. You notice the ingenuity required. Herbs and poultices are used creatively, grain is rationed meticulously, and work schedules are adapted to conserve energy. Survival is neither glamorous nor straightforward. It is a continual negotiation between necessity, resourcefulness, and endurance. The castle's social dynamics continue to shape life. Laborers and servants remain vulnerable to disease, hunger, and the whims of authority, yet they also develop subtle forms of influence. Knowledge of the castle, where food is stored, how systems function, which nobles are merciful or cruel, becomes power in its own right. You observe that survival often depends on observation, careful planning, and discretion. Even small acts, storing extra food for a sick child, protecting a colleague from punishment, or learning to navigate corridors efficiently, can determine life or death. Hierarchy persists, but the rigid structures are tempered by experience. Nobility learn, sometimes reluctantly, that their power is not absolute. If laborers fall ill, crops are left untended. If the kitchen fails, meals vanish. If morale collapses, order breaks down. You notice that the daily interdependence of castle inhabitants becomes clearer with each crisis. Survival is a collective enterprise, regardless of rank. The Lord may command, but the lower-ranking individuals ensure that command can be carried out at all. Disease continues to shape both the physical and social environment. Outbreaks of fever or dysentery may return unexpectedly, reminding everyone that control is partial. You witness rituals designed to mitigate fear, quarantines, prayers, and the use of herbs. Even as these measures offer only partial protection, they create a sense of agency, a way for people to exert some influence over circumstances otherwise dictated by chance. Adaptation becomes a crucial skill, taught through observation, experience, and the guidance of those who survived previous crises. Hunger remains a recurring challenge. Seasonal scarcity, poor harvests, and storage limitations ensure that food is never abundant. You see creativity and cooperation in action. Villagers and servants collaborate to preserve grain, share provisions, and stretch limited supplies. Simple acts of ingenuity, a barrel turned into a water filter, a patchwork stew to supplement meager rations become essential strategies. Hunger teaches endurance, patience, and ingenuity, demonstrating that survival is not solely about strength, but about clever, careful management of resources. Life in the castle also leaves psychological imprints. Isolation, fear, and repeated crises create a heightened awareness of mortality. People develop routines, rituals, and coping mechanisms to maintain mental stability. Humor, gossip, communal work, and even small religious ceremonies provide structure and reassurance. You notice that those who endure over the long term are not necessarily the strongest physically, but those who adapt mentally, forming networks of support, observing patterns, and negotiating challenges with careful attention to both human and environmental variables. The castle, in its endurance, preserves memory. Stories of past sieges, famine, and epidemics circulate through generations, shaping collective understanding. Children learn not only practical skills, farming, cooking, basic medicine, but also the history of resilience within these walls. Oral traditions record strategies for survival, moments of heroism, and cautionary tales of failure. Even as kings fight wars and nobles pursue power, the human experience of endurance and adaptation is preserved within the stone walls, quietly shaping the society beyond. Over time, you observe subtle shifts in power, practice, and social relations. Servants gain expertise that grants them influence. Laborers develop negotiation skills based on essential knowledge. Minor officials act with discretion to preserve stability. The castle is not static. It is a living environment shaped by human ingenuity, cooperation, and adaptation. Those who endure learn the subtle art of balancing obedience with initiative, fear with resilience, and scarcity with creativity. As you reflect, a pattern emerges. Life inside a medieval castle, though harsh, dangerous, and isolating, illustrates a profound truth about human existence. Survival is not determined by privilege alone, nor by sheer force. It is determined by adaptability, endurance, observation, and the ability to navigate social and environmental constraints. Ordinary people, servants, laborers, and minor officials play indispensable roles in sustaining life, even if their contributions are rarely recorded in chronicles or remembered by history. You are left with a lingering question. How do humans endure long-term hardship without surrendering hope, dignity, or community? How do ordinary lives trapped within stone walls, constrained by hierarchy, and threatened by scarcity shape the broader course of history? And perhaps most strikingly, what lessons about resilience, adaptation, and collective effort does this experience offer for societies in all eras, including our own? In the end, the castle is both fortress and crucible. Its walls preserve life and memory, yet they also expose fragility, inequality, and vulnerability. Those who survive here do more than endure. They adapt, cooperate, and innovate, leaving behind legacies of resilience that ripple through generations. And in observing this, you realize that history is not only the story of battles, lords, and sieges. It is the quiet, persistent story of ordinary people, navigating extraordinary challenges, learning, enduring and shaping the world in ways that are often invisible but undeniably profound. Story 4. The horrors of medieval medicine. You wake to the sounds of distant horns and the creaking of wagons on muddy roads. Outside your village, smoke rises from a field that was burned in a raid the night before. The year is 1337, and France and England have entered a war that will stretch for over a century. You are not a knight, a lord, or a soldier. You are a peasant, a laborer, someone whose life has been defined by the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and maintaining the small plot of land your family relies on for survival. Yet suddenly, everything familiar has become uncertain. The war arrives not in grand battles but in small, devastating incursions. Armies pass through villages, often stripping food, livestock, and supplies. You watch as barns are emptied, animals driven away, and homes looted. Even if you are not directly attacked, the fear alone is suffocating. Every knock at the gate, every movement in the woods, every sound of hooves in the distance is a potential threat. You learn quickly that survival depends not only on hard work, but on vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to endure repeated trauma. Food becomes scarce. Fields are trampled by passing armies, seed stores are confiscated, and the harvest is delayed or destroyed. Families like yours struggle to find enough to eat, relying on root vegetables, stored grains, and occasional wild game. Hunger becomes a constant companion, and you notice that even small meals are rationed with meticulous care. Each bite is a balance between immediate sustenance and the need to conserve for tomorrow, a delicate calculation that can mean life or death over a season. Disease spreads alongside war. Armies bring not only destruction but also illness. Soldiers carry fevers, dysentery, and other ailments that easily infect villages already weakened by famine and malnutrition. You see neighbors succumb to disease in alarming numbers, children particularly vulnerable. Medical knowledge is rudimentary. Herbal remedies, prayers, and isolation are the only defenses, yet even these measures offer limited protection. In a world of constant movement and upheaval, health is fragile, and the mortality rate is high. Everyday labor becomes more dangerous and unpredictable. You may spend weeks plowing fields only to see the work undone by marauders or raiders. Tools and livestock are stolen, fences destroyed, and crops ruined. Work itself becomes a negotiation between necessity and risk. Do you attempt to repair fences during the day, knowing raiders could appear, or wait until night, risking accidents or injuries? Each choice is fraught with consequences, teaching that survival is a constant balance between courage, timing, and luck. The war also changes social structures in subtle ways. Lords demand new forms of taxation to fund armies, while mercenary bands operate with little oversight, imposing arbitrary authority. You notice that peasants must navigate complex networks of power, negotiating with multiple forces simultaneously. Local lords, invading soldiers, and fellow villagers. Alliances and loyalties shift constantly, and knowledge becomes a form of currency, knowing who to trust, when to act, and how to avoid unnecessary danger can determine survival. Psychological strain is immense. Nights are restless with fear, days heavy with labor, and every interaction carries the potential for violence. Children grow up knowing that life is precarious, that safety is fragile, and that the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and community rituals can be interrupted by forces entirely beyond their control. You begin to understand that endurance is as much mental as it is physical. Hope, routine, and memory become essential tools in navigating life during prolonged conflict. You witness acts of ingenuity and courage everywhere. Neighbors hide livestock, children warn of approaching soldiers, and families improvise meals from whatever resources remain. Even the smallest victories, keeping a barn intact, successfully hiding grain, or surviving a night without attack, carry enormous significance. These are quiet, unrecorded acts of heroism, yet they sustain the community and allow ordinary people to navigate a world dominated by war. Religion offers both solace and tension. Priests and monks encourage prayers for safety, blessings for crops, and protection from invading forces. Yet the church itself is not immune. Monasteries may be plundered, and clergy sometimes flee or become complicit in local power struggles. Faith becomes intertwined with survival, ritual with practicality. You may light candles, offer prayers, and perform rites not solely for devotion, but as structured actions that provide reassurance in a world of uncertainty. As seasons pass, you notice that adaptation is constant. Villages organize lookouts, establish safe storage areas, and develop signals for approaching danger. Families plan harvests and labor to minimize exposure to raids. Even simple tools, ropes, carts, fences are maintained and adapted with extraordinary care. Survival is a combination of foresight, cooperation, and relentless observation. The war is not fought in grand battles for peasants. It is fought in the management of daily life, in incremental adaptations that protect family, land, and livelihood. And yet, you are left with a persistent question. How does a society endure decades of intermittent but relentless war? How do ordinary people maintain cohesion, culture, and routine when external forces continually threaten existence? And perhaps most strikingly, what becomes of those who survive their traditions, social structures, and understanding of human resilience after generations of disruption? The 100 Years' War, for those living outside the grand castles and royal courts, is a story of endurance, adaptation, and the subtle exertion of agency. It is not chronicled in epic tales of kings and generals, but in the careful preservation of seed, the vigilance of neighbors, and the quiet courage of families navigating an unrelenting world. You begin to realize that history is shaped as much by these ordinary lives as by the battles and treaties recorded in official chronicles. As the 100 Years' War drags on, you quickly realize that the conflict is not a series of discrete battles, but a continuous disruption that permeates every aspect of life. Years of intermittent warfare leave villages depopulated, roads unsafe, and harvests uncertain. Each season brings the familiar but terrifying cycle: planting, tending, and harvesting crops under the ever-present risk of raids, requisitions, or conscription by one army or another. You, like your neighbors, learn to plan life around unpredictability, prioritizing survival over comfort, safety over ambition. One of the most immediate pressures is food scarcity. With fields trampled or burned by passing soldiers, your family must rely on stored grain, root vegetables, and what livestock remains. You notice that meals become smaller, more repetitive, and carefully rationed. The inability to secure consistent sustenance weakens bodies, making illness and injury even more dangerous. Hunger becomes not only a physical challenge but a psychological one. Every meal is a negotiation between present need and future security. People adapt creatively, stretching limited ingredients into soups, porridges, or stews that provide minimal nourishment yet sustain life. Disease remains a constant threat, exacerbated by displacement and the close quarters of crowded villages. Epidemics plague, dysentery, fever travel alongside armies. You witness families isolated by illness, children orphaned, and older generations succumbing to infections that would have been minor in more stable times. Quarantine is improvised, herbal remedies applied, and prayers offered, but survival is unpredictable. You notice that knowledge about medicine, hygiene, and symptom management becomes a survival skill, passed informally among neighbors. What works and what kills is learned experientially, often through tragic trial and error. Labor itself becomes a hazardous enterprise. You spend long days tending to crops, repairing fences, and securing food, often under the threat of armed parties passing through. Tools are precious. A broken plow or lost ox can endanger survival. Every task carries risk. Injury, theft, or even accusations of disloyalty from nobles or soldiers can have deadly consequences. You begin to understand that endurance is both physical and strategic, relying on observation, timing, and anticipation. Those who adapt hiding supplies, planting in secret, or traveling cautiously to markets have a better chance of survival. Social structures strain under pressure. Local lords, burdened by the need to supply troops or maintain control, impose new taxes, levy soldiers, or requisition goods, often with little regard for villagers' capacity. Mercenary bands or undisciplined troops further disrupt communities. You notice that social hierarchy becomes both a protective and dangerous factor. Alignment with a lord can provide some security, yet it also exposes you to exploitation or danger when loyalties shift. Ordinary people navigate these pressures with a mixture of diplomacy, caution, and ingenuity, often quietly defying authority when possible to protect family and livelihood. Fear and psychological strain permeate daily life. Nights are restless, filled with the sounds of distant hoofbeats, barking dogs, or fires in nearby villages. You worry about the safety of neighbors, the security of food stores, and the potential loss of home. Children grow up learning vigilance, adults cultivate prudence, and communities develop routines to cope with uncertainty. Humor, small ceremonies, and gossip provide temporary relief, anchoring social cohesion in the midst of persistent danger. You notice that these coping mechanisms are as essential as food or tools for maintaining survival over the long term. Yet amid the chaos, you witness resilience and ingenuity. Neighbors hide livestock in secret pens, coordinate lookouts for approaching troops, or develop signals to warn of danger. Small victories, successfully defending a storehouse, protecting a child from harm, or preserving seed for the next planting, become monumental achievements. These acts of resourcefulness, though rarely recorded in chronicles, demonstrate human creativity and endurance. Survival is not passive. It requires constant observation, adaptation, and cooperative effort. Religious life offers both comfort and complication. Priests continue to preach faith, encouraging prayers for safety and protection from invaders. At the same time, churches and monasteries themselves are not immune to the war's disruptions. Monks and clergy may flee, supplies may be stolen, and the moral authority of spiritual leaders is sometimes undermined by the chaos surrounding them. Yet faith endures as a tool for psychological stability, reinforcing communal bonds, guiding behavior, and providing rituals that structure life amid uncertainty. Over time, you notice incremental adaptations. Villages develop safer travel routes, store food more effectively, and share information about troop movements. Families train children in vigilance, survival skills, and rudimentary medical knowledge. Social networks strengthen as mutual aid becomes essential. Neighbors help each other tend fields, hide supplies, or care for the sick. These adaptations are quiet, subtle, and cumulative, creating resilience that is less dramatic than a battle victory but more enduring in the long term. You begin to see that ordinary people, through endurance and ingenuity, shape history in ways that kings and generals cannot fully control. The war disrupts, damages, and challenges, but it also catalyzes adaptation, cooperation, and subtle social change. Survival is neither passive nor guaranteed. It is the product of observation, knowledge, and the ability to respond creatively to relentless adversity. And yet, you are left with a pressing question. How does a society maintain cohesion, culture, and daily life when external forces continuously threaten existence? How do ordinary people preserve identity, stability, and memory while navigating decades of uncertainty and danger? The answers are elusive, but the evidence is everywhere in hidden stores of grain, improvised shelters, and the quiet endurance of children, families, and neighbors who persist despite the extraordinary challenges imposed by war. The 100 Years' War, for those living outside the grand chronicles of kings and battles, is a story not of glory but of survival, adaptation, and quiet resilience. You begin to understand that the course of history is shaped not only by epic conflicts, but by the countless choices, innovations, and endurance of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Decades pass, and the 100 Years' War grinds on, leaving its mark not only on kingdoms, but on the lives of the people who inhabit the countryside. You have endured raids, disease, famine, and displacement. Fields once rich with crops have been trampled, homes burned, and families scattered. Yet you are still here, part of a network of ordinary people who have adapted, endured, and found ways to maintain life despite chaos. The war, while catastrophic, has revealed the remarkable resilience of human communities. Survival has required extraordinary adaptability. You have learned to store food in hidden caches, to sow crops that are hardy against irregular conditions, and to anticipate the movements of soldiers and mercenaries. Villages develop systems of cooperation. Neighbors share labor, watch each other's properties, and pass on knowledge of safe travel routes or natural remedies for illness. Small innovations, often mundane like reinforcing granaries or improvising irrigation, become vital strategies for enduring repeated hardship. You realize that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but of these incremental, creative acts of survival. Population shifts have reshaped communities. Many families flee permanently, seeking safer regions, while others migrate seasonally to protect crops or livestock. Some villages never recover, abandoned entirely, while new settlements emerge in previously marginal areas. You notice that these movements create networks of kinship and support that are flexible and adaptive, able to respond to both environmental and social pressures. Over time, these adaptations influence the long-term structure of rural life, subtly transforming social hierarchies and community dynamics. Disease and famine continue to leave their mark. Survivors carry both physical and psychological scars, and mortality remains high, particularly among children and the elderly. Yet the knowledge accumulated from surviving repeated crises strengthens communities. You learn to recognize early signs of illness, to ration food carefully, and to negotiate with both lords and opportunistic soldiers. Each act of endurance and adaptation, though small and often unrecorded, becomes part of a cumulative legacy that shapes future generations. The war also forces subtle social and economic change. With labor scarce after repeated devastation, peasants gain slightly more leverage in negotiating rents, obligations, and wages. You notice that this increased agency is fragile and often resisted by local nobility, yet it introduces new dynamics into the relationship between lords and laborers. Communities slowly develop strategies for self-preservation, ranging from collective defense to discreet resistance, planting seeds for social transformation in ways that may not be immediately visible but will resonate over generations. Even faith evolves in response to the prolonged turmoil. Religious practice provides structure, comfort, and hope amid uncertainty, yet it also reflects the strain of living under relentless threat. You see clergy adapting rituals to strengthen morale, offering prayers for protection and mediating disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. Religion becomes a practical tool as well as a spiritual one, guiding behavior, reinforcing social cohesion, and helping communities endure. Psychologically, endurance becomes second nature. Children learn vigilance, adults cultivate strategic patience, and communities find ways to maintain morale despite repeated setbacks. You notice that ordinary people develop resilience not only through action but through social bonds, storytelling, and the preservation of memory. Tales of raids survived, hidden granaries preserved, and families kept intact serve as oral histories, reinforcing collective identity and reinforcing the value of endurance. As the war eventually winds down, the landscape is forever altered socially, economically, and psychologically. Villages have adapted to scarcity, fortified networks of mutual support, and learned to negotiate both the whims of nobility and the dangers of conflict. Ordinary people carry lessons in resourcefulness, vigilance, and cooperation that will persist long after the last battle has been fought. You recognize that the war has not only caused destruction, but has also catalyzed resilience, ingenuity, and subtle societal change. And yet questions remain. How much of this adaptation is permanent? Will future generations inherit stability, or will the next crisis repeat the cycle of fear, scarcity, and displacement? How do ordinary lives, often invisible in grand narratives, shape the contours of history? You realize that while kings, generals, and treaties dominate chronicles, the survival strategies of peasants, merchants, and laborers quietly define the social and economic fabric for generations to come. In the end, the 100 Years' War, from the perspective of ordinary people, is a story of quiet heroism and resilience. Victory or defeat in battle is secondary to the ongoing struggle to maintain life, community, and continuity in a world shaped by uncertainty and danger. Survival itself becomes an achievement of historical significance, a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and cooperation. And as you reflect on the lives of those who endured, you understand that history is built as much by the steady, adaptive labor of ordinary people as by the grand decisions of kings and generals. The war ends in political terms, but the lessons of human resilience, adaptation, and communal endurance echo far beyond the battlefield. They remind you that ordinary lives, lived with courage, care, and ingenuity, are the invisible threads that hold the fabric of society together even in the darkest of times. Story 5: The Siege of Orleans. Starvation, disease, and desperation. You wake with a dull ache in your side, a fever running hot, and a cough that rattles your chest. In your village, the nearest physician is miles away, and even if you could reach one, treatment is often limited, expensive, or dangerous. Instead, you rely on a combination of herbal remedies, folk knowledge, and religious ritual, hoping that anything will relieve the suffering. Life in the Middle Ages is fragile, and disease is an ever-present companion. You quickly learn that survival often depends not on heroic interventions, but on small, practical strategies, cautious observation, and sheer luck. Medicine is a mix of observation, superstition, and tradition. You notice that herbal remedies are the most common treatment: willow bark for pain, garlic to ward off infection, and chamomile to soothe the stomach. These treatments work sometimes, fail other times, and often coexist with ritualistic or religious practices. Priests or local healers may recite prayers, sprinkle holy water, or bless poultices, combining spiritual and practical approaches. Healing in this world is not simply a matter of science, it is an art, a blend of knowledge passed down through generations, and a negotiation with forces both natural and divine. You quickly discover that understanding the body is rudimentary. Anatomy is based on observation and inference, often informed by ancient texts and theories of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness is believed to result from imbalance among these humors, leading to treatments like bloodletting, purging, and the application of leeches. The logic seems compelling, yet its efficacy is inconsistent at best, sometimes harmful at worst. You may witness a neighbor grow weaker after treatment rather than stronger, and you come to understand that in medicine, hope and risk are inseparable. Disease is ubiquitous. Smallpox, dysentery, plague, and fevers strike without warning. Children are particularly vulnerable, and mortality is high. Epidemics sweep through villages, towns, and cities, often more deadly than war itself. You notice that survival is a mixture of proximity, luck, and access to care. Families develop strategies to limit exposure, avoiding crowded markets, isolating the sick, and relying on herbal preventative measures. These small actions, while limited in scientific basis, are often effective enough to preserve life and community. Sanitation is another constant concern. Water sources are shared with animals, latrines are rudimentary, and waste accumulates in streets and homes. You realize that infections spread easily and unpredictably, and that prevention often depends on vigilance rather than medicine. Boiling water, careful preparation of food, and separating the sick from the healthy are strategies that gradually evolve into practical forms of public health, even if the reasoning behind them is imperfect. Childbirth is particularly perilous. Mothers face high mortality rates, as do infants. You observe midwives using a combination of herbal remedies, massage, and prayer to assist in deliveries. Their skill is remarkable, but success is never guaranteed. Even minor complications can be fatal, and birth becomes an event defined by uncertainty, endurance, and the practical application of accumulated knowledge. The fragility of life is visible in every household, shaping decisions, expectations, and the rhythms of daily life. Injury is common, whether from labor, accidents, or violence. Simple cuts can become infected, fractures may heal poorly, and sprains or broken bones are managed with rudimentary splints and bandaging. Healing is slow, and the risk of complications is constant. You see that patience, care, and resourcefulness, along with the support of family and neighbors, often matter as much as the remedies themselves. Survival is rarely the result of a single intervention. It is the cumulative effect of observation, cautious action, and adaptation. Magic, superstition, and ritual play a significant role in health. Amulets, charms, prayers, and incantations coexist with herbal remedies and rudimentary surgery. You notice that these practices serve multiple purposes. They provide psychological comfort, create a sense of control, and reinforce communal bonds. Even if their efficacy is uncertain, the act of performing rituals, blessing a wound, wearing a charm, reciting protective prayers offers structure in a world where illness is unpredictable and mortality is high. You also begin to see the role of mobility in survival. Traveling physicians, wandering healers, and apothecaries move between villages and towns, bringing knowledge, supplies, and sometimes cures. Access to these itinerant specialists can mean the difference between life and death, yet their services are often expensive or inconsistent. Ordinary people must weigh the cost, travel risks, and potential benefits of seeking help, balancing hope with pragmatism. Ultimately, you come to understand that medieval medicine is not simply a matter of ignorance or superstition. It is a system shaped by observation, tradition, adaptation, and necessity. Ordinary people, peasants, laborers, midwives play a central role in maintaining health, applying practical knowledge, and preserving experience across generations. Healing is a collective effort, reliant on community, observation, and the resilience of those willing to endure illness, uncertainty, and risk. And yet, as you tend a feverish child or prepare a poultice for a neighbor, you are left with a lingering question. How did people endure the constant presence of illness, death, and imperfect remedies without surrendering hope or abandoning community? What lessons can we draw from lives lived in such fragile, precarious conditions, where survival itself required ingenuity, vigilance, and collective effort? Medicine in the Middle Ages is not only about curing disease, it is about enduring it, managing risk, and maintaining the fragile fabric of human life in a world where illness and injury are constant companions. It is in these ordinary acts of care, observation, and adaptation that you begin to see the quiet resilience of medieval society, the subtle ways that human ingenuity preserves life, even in the face of uncertainty and danger. As you navigate life in a medieval village or castle, you begin to notice that survival in the face of illness and injury depends less on formal medical expertise and more on careful observation, adaptability, and community knowledge. The remedies you learned in childhood, herbs, poultices, prayers, remain central, but you now understand their application is highly situational. What works in one household may fail in another, and success often depends on timing, individual resilience, and the subtle variations in plants, preparation, and environment. Disease shapes every aspect of daily life. Fevers, infections, and gastrointestinal illnesses can strike suddenly, sometimes taking the strongest individuals first. You notice that families develop informal monitoring systems. Children are watched for signs of fatigue or pallor, The elderly are isolated if they show weakness, and neighbors communicate warnings about contagious illnesses. Early intervention, removing contaminated food, applying herbal treatments, and isolating the sick becomes critical. Survival is as much about preventative measures as it is about direct treatment. Childbirth continues to be one of the riskiest times in life. Midwives, often women with decades of experience, blend observation, intuition, and ritual to assist mothers and infants. You see the careful preparation of birthing spaces, herbs to ward off infection, clean linens, and the positioning of the mother. These practices, while rudimentary by modern standards, dramatically improve survival rates compared to haphazard births. Even small innovations such as boiling water, sterilizing tools, or keeping a newborn warm demonstrate practical problem-solving that arises directly from lived experience. Injury management is another domain where adaptation and resourcefulness dominate. Broken bones are splinted with wood and linen. Wounds are cleaned with vinegar or wine, dressed with herbs, and monitored carefully. You notice that communities develop knowledge about which herbs reduce inflammation, which poultices soothe infection, and which practices worsen outcomes. This knowledge is shared informally among households and passed from one generation to the next. Survival depends on observation, trial and error, and careful attention to detail, a continual negotiation with risk and uncertainty. Psychological resilience is equally critical. Illness is not merely physical. It isolates, frightens, and disrupts routines. You see communities using rituals, prayer, storytelling, and social support to maintain hope. Gathering around a hearth, sharing food, or offering practical assistance to the sick strengthens bonds and mitigates fear. You begin to understand that survival is not purely biological. It is social, emotional, and collective. Those who endure do so not in isolation, but with the support of family, neighbors, and even strangers. Access to external knowledge is sporadic but influential. Traveling physicians, herbalists, and apothecaries provide treatments that villagers cannot produce themselves, introducing new techniques, ingredients, or understandings of the body. However, these specialists are inconsistent, and their methods vary widely. You notice that ordinary people must balance the promise of new remedies with the cost, travel risk, and potential harm. Learning from these itinerant experts while adapting practices locally becomes a survival strategy, blending formal and informal knowledge. Disease outbreaks prompt innovative community-level adaptations. Quarantine measures, separation of the sick, and careful handling of food and water emerge as practical responses to recurring illness. Even without full understanding of contagion, you notice villagers developing effective patterns of prevention, avoiding crowded spaces, timing work to minimize exposure, and using herbal cleansers. These incremental strategies accumulate over generations, forming the basis of practical public health, long before germ theory or scientific medicine. Religion remains intertwined with medical practice. Prayers, relics, and rituals are used alongside herbal remedies and practical care. You see that faith offers both psychological comfort and social cohesion. Public prayers reinforce community bonds, while personal rituals provide a sense of control over uncontrollable events. The blending of spiritual and practical approaches illustrates a pragmatic approach to survival. In the absence of certainty, people use every tool available, physical, social, and spiritual, to preserve life. Observation and learning are central to enduring illness. You begin to recognize patterns: which treatments reduce fever, which herbs ease pain, which behaviors promote recovery, and which worsen outcomes. Knowledge is fluid, situational, and often shared orally or through apprenticeship. Even without formal education, ordinary people develop sophisticated understandings of the body, environment, and practical interventions. Experience becomes the primary teacher, and survival is a matter of careful attention to cause, effect, and timing. Yet as you care for the sick, tend to the injured, and manage daily health risks, a question lingers. How do communities maintain hope, cohesion, and continuity when illness is constant and mortality high? How do ordinary people, without formal training or resources, develop systems of observation, adaptation, and care that allow entire communities to survive repeated crises? The answers lie not in heroic interventions, but in the quiet persistence, ingenuity, and cooperation of countless individuals navigating uncertainty together. You realize that medieval medicine, though primitive by modern standards, reflects a deeper truth about human survival. That resilience is cultivated through observation, adaptation, shared knowledge, and social support. Ordinary people, healers, laborers, parents, neighbors are the backbone of this system, their ingenuity and endurance ensuring that communities continue despite uncertainty, disease, and frequent loss. Years pass, and you begin to see the patterns and consequences of a life lived in constant negotiation with illness, injury, and scarcity. Medieval medicine is not heroic. It does not rely on miraculous cures, but it is profoundly human, grounded in observation, adaptation, and community cooperation. You notice that survival depends as much on social networks, careful routines, and practical ingenuity as it does on the remedies themselves. The lived experience of health and disease becomes a central thread in the fabric of medieval society. Recovery from illness is a delicate process. The sick require careful attention, herbal treatments applied consistently, rest, clean bedding, and supportive care from family and neighbors. Even the simplest interventions, keeping a feverish child hydrated, a wound clean, or a newborn warm, can make the difference between life and death. You realize that survival is cumulative, built from countless small acts of vigilance and care rather than dramatic interventions. Each life preserved is a testament to observation, patience, and incremental adaptation. Childbirth, once one of the most dangerous events in life, continues to illustrate the importance of practical knowledge. Midwives guide mothers with experience and intuition, supplementing herbal remedies with careful monitoring and structured rituals. You notice that their expertise passed orally and through apprenticeship ensures that many lives survive that might otherwise have been lost. These women, often overlooked in official chronicles, are crucial agents of continuity, shaping families, communities, and ultimately the social structure of their regions. Injury management reveals similar patterns. Broken bones, cuts, burns, and sprains are common, and improper care can be fatal. You see that communities develop systems for observation, shared knowledge, and cautious experimentation with remedies. Tools and techniques evolve slowly, reflecting the iterative nature of learning. Each success, each recovery, reinforces local knowledge and is passed down, strengthening the resilience of entire villages. Ordinary people, through necessity and experience, become practitioners of a practical, adaptive form of medicine. Psychological endurance is equally critical. Illness and injury disrupt not only bodies but social routines and emotional stability. You notice that communal rituals, prayers, and caregiving reinforce social cohesion, maintaining morale and structure in the midst of uncertainty. Stories of survival, tips for herbal remedies, and oral histories of successful treatments circulate, creating networks of practical wisdom. Survival, you realize, is not merely biological, it is social, psychological, and cultural. Access to itinerant physicians, herbalists, and apothecaries provides intermittent assistance, introducing new techniques and ingredients. Yet ordinary people often rely more on locally available resources, improvisation, and accumulated experience. You observe that the blend of formal and informal knowledge creates a resilient system capable of responding to uncertainty. Communities adapt treatments based on observed outcomes, learning from trial, error, and careful observation. This iterative process strengthens local expertise and ensures continuity of care across generations. Religion and ritual continue to play dual roles. Prayers, charms, and blessings may not cure disease in the modern sense, but they offer psychological reassurance, structure, and collective participation. You see that spiritual practices support both the caregiver and the patient, reinforcing resilience, hope, and community bonds. In this context, faith becomes a practical tool, integrated seamlessly with herbal remedies, hygiene practices, and social support networks. Over time, you recognize that ordinary people are the true backbone of survival. Their ingenuity, observation, and cooperation preserve life in a world where disease is omnipresent and remedies are imperfect. Villages survive epidemics, families endure high child mortality, and communities maintain social continuity despite repeated crises. History may remember kings, battles, and laws, but it is these quiet acts, caregiving, observation, experimentation, and adaptation that sustain life and ensure the persistence of culture and society. And yet, you are left with a lingering reflection. How does ordinary ingenuity shape the course of human history? How do lives lived in constant negotiation with illness, scarcity, and risk contribute to resilience across generations? You begin to see that survival is an active, ongoing process, and that every small decision, how to treat a wound, how to prepare food, how to care for a neighbor, ripples across time, influencing not only individual lives but the enduring strength of communities. Medieval medicine, in all its imperfection, teaches a profound lesson. Resilience is cultivated, not granted. It arises from observation, adaptation, shared knowledge, and the quiet persistence of ordinary people. The acts of healing, whether through herbs, ritual, or careful care, illustrate a broader truth about human life, that endurance, ingenuity, and cooperation are as critical to survival as any technology or formal knowledge. In these small, persistent actions, the human spirit demonstrates its capacity to survive, adapt, and shape the course of history, one ordinary life at a time. Story 6: Witch Hunts and the Fear of Women. The soil is hard, cracked, and unyielding beneath your fingers. The season's rains have failed, and the crops that you planted months ago lie withered in the field. You stare at the barren land, aware that your family's survival depends on what little remains in your granary. The year is 1315, and Europe is entering one of its most devastating famines. You are not a lord or a king. You are a peasant, one of thousands whose lives depend entirely on the unpredictable rhythms of weather, labor, and luck. Famine is not sudden, it creeps in gradually. A poor harvest, delayed planting, or unexpected frost reduces yields. You begin to ration grain, making soups, porridge, and bread that barely sustains life. Livestock, once plentiful, are slaughtered early to prevent starvation, leaving families without milk, eggs, or labor animals. Every decision is a delicate balance between present consumption and future survival. One miscalculation could mean empty stomachs, illness, or death for the weakest members of your household. You notice that famine affects more than just the body. It disrupts social structures, labor patterns, and community cohesion. Villagers who normally cooperate may turn to conflict over scarce resources. Markets collapse as prices soar and goods vanish. Nobles demand taxes even when peasants cannot pay, adding political pressure to physical deprivation. Families adapt by sharing resources secretly, hiding stored grain, or negotiating new work arrangements with local lords. Survival depends not only on food, but on relationships, strategy, and careful observation of neighbors and authorities. Disease follows famine like a shadow. Malnutrition weakens bodies, making children particularly vulnerable to illness. Outbreaks of dysentery, fevers, and respiratory infections spread quickly through weakened populations. You notice that herbal remedies, prayers, and improvised sanitation are essential tools, yet their effectiveness is limited. Death becomes commonplace, leaving households smaller, labor weaker, and social networks fragile. The famine reshapes communities physically and psychologically, leaving scars that endure long after the harvest finally returns. Hunger changes daily routines. Work is slowed, often interrupted by weakness or illness. Fields are weeded less efficiently, repairs delayed, and chores become increasingly exhausting. Children are pulled from apprenticeships or schooling to help gather food or tend livestock. Even small acts of maintenance, mending tools, preparing food, carrying water demand extraordinary energy. You notice that survival becomes an exercise in endurance, improvisation, and the careful allocation of limited resources. Food sources are diversified wherever possible. Wild herbs, roots, and berries supplement meager rations. Fish may be caught from nearby streams, and small game hunted cautiously. You learn to recognize edible plants, understand seasonal availability, and store what can be preserved. Techniques like drying, salting, or smoking food become crucial, even rudimentary forms of preservation making the difference between life and death. Knowledge of the natural environment, what is safe to eat, when and where to find it, becomes a critical survival skill, often shared through oral tradition. Social tension rises during famine. Desperation leads some to theft, hoarding, or fleeing villages. You see neighbors who previously shared labor and resources suddenly guarding their granaries fiercely. Yet in other instances, cooperation intensifies. Families band together to cultivate remaining plots, share food discreetly, and protect the vulnerable. Survival is a mix of competition and collaboration, with human ingenuity and social networks determining who endures and who falls victim to scarcity. The psychological impact is profound. Fear, despair, and uncertainty dominate daily life. Children grow up associating hunger with danger, learning early that survival requires vigilance and adaptability. Adults develop strategies to manage stress. Communal meals, prayer, storytelling, and mutual support become lifelines, maintaining morale and cohesion in the face of relentless hardship. Mental resilience is as vital as physical endurance in navigating the famine. Religious and ritual practices intersect with survival strategies. People pray for rain, fast for penance, or hold processions to seek divine intervention. While such practices do not directly increase food, they provide psychological structure, communal cohesion, and a sense of agency in an environment dominated by forces beyond human control. Faith and practical action coexist, each reinforcing the other, as villagers attempt to make sense of scarcity and exert influence over their circumstances. Yet amid despair, small victories are monumental. A successful hunt, a hidden cache of grain, a neighbor who shares what little remains. These moments sustain families and communities. You notice that survival is not heroic in the traditional sense, but is measured in incremental successes, careful planning, and the ability to adapt to harsh realities. Endurance, creativity, and cooperation become the essential tools for navigating famine. And still, as you watch the season progress and the soil remain unforgiving, you are left with a persistent question. How do societies endure repeated famines, preserving knowledge, culture, and cohesion across generations? How do ordinary people maintain hope, identity, and continuity when hunger threatens both body and social bonds? And perhaps most importantly, what long-term effects does living in such scarcity have on values, behaviors, and resilience? Famine in the Middle Ages is not only a test of physical endurance, it is a crucible for social cohesion, ingenuity, and human adaptability. Ordinary people, facing starvation and disease, develop practical knowledge, survival strategies, and communal networks that ensure the persistence of life, even in the harshest circumstances. The lessons of these experiences ripple through generations, leaving a legacy of resilience quietly etched into the fabric of society. The famine drags on, and each day brings new challenges. The soil, poor from repeated crop failures, barely yields enough to feed your family. Livestock has been reduced to a few scrawny animals, and even wild game is scarce. You quickly learn that survival depends not merely on enduring hunger, but on devising strategies, sharing knowledge, and observing patterns in both nature and human behavior. The famine transforms ordinary routines into careful calculations of risk, reward, and timing. You notice that resource management is paramount. Every kernel of grain, every preserved vegetable, every drop of milk is carefully rationed. Families track consumption meticulously, dividing portions to stretch supplies over weeks or months. Surplus food is hidden, sometimes buried or concealed in attics, to prevent theft by neighbors or passing soldiers. Small decisions when to eat, when to reserve, and how to allocate food among children, laborers, and the elderly carry life-or-death consequences. Survival becomes a careful balance of foresight, prudence, and observation. Communal cooperation is critical, even as scarcity breeds tension. Villagers form informal networks to share food, labor, and information about the availability of wild edibles. Some families exchange labor for meals, tending neighbors' fields or caring for livestock in return for a share of their harvest. You see that survival is rarely an individual effort. It relies on negotiation, trust, and the willingness to pool resources while navigating the risk of exploitation. Communities develop tacit rules of reciprocity, and breaking these unwritten codes can have dire consequences for both individuals and social cohesion. Adaptation extends to diet. You gather wild plants, roots, and berries previously considered supplementary or even undesirable. Acorns are leached and ground into flour. Nettles are boiled to supplement greens. River fish are caught and preserved. You notice that knowledge of the local environment's seasonal cycles, edible species, and preservation techniques is essential. Families rely on experience passed through generations to make life-sustaining decisions, blending observation, tradition, and experimentation. Even small innovations, such as drying herbs or fermenting grains, become vital tools for survival. Hunger and famine also exacerbate social tensions with local lords. Tax demands, rent obligations, and forced labor continue despite the scarcity. You observe that some villagers attempt to negotiate, delay, or conceal resources, balancing deference with practical self-preservation. Conflict between lords and peasants becomes more pronounced, as scarcity magnifies power dynamics. At the same time, you notice moments of cooperation. Lords may provide emergency food relief or negotiate labor to ensure long-term productivity. Survival is as much a social negotiation as a physical challenge. Disease spreads more readily during famine. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making even minor illnesses deadly. You see families improvising care, herbal remedies, clean bedding, and isolation of the sick. Villagers quickly learn which interventions help and which are harmful, passing this knowledge orally. Even in the absence of formal medical training, survival becomes a skill cultivated through observation, experience, and communal learning. You realize that health, nutrition, and social organization are deeply interconnected, each influencing the other in the fight against scarcity. Children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. Families make careful decisions about who works in the fields, who forages, and who receives the most sustenance. Children may be sent to relatives or neighbors with surplus food, or they may take on labor beyond their age to support survival. You notice that survival strategies are not only physical but also social. The distribution of labor, resources, and protection within the household is calculated to maximize collective endurance. The family becomes a microcosm of strategic planning, adaptation, and resilience. Even amid scarcity, ingenuity emerges. Simple tools are repurposed, abandoned land is cultivated with improvised techniques, and fermentation, smoking, and drying extend the lifespan of food. You see households experimenting cautiously, observing outcomes and sharing successful methods with neighbors. The famine becomes a driver of subtle innovation, forcing ordinary people to refine knowledge, optimize resources, and create solutions under extreme constraints. Survival is a product of both skill and observation, of small adaptations repeated over time. Faith and ritual continue to guide communities. Prayers for rain, fasts for penance, and processions to sacred sites offer psychological support. These practices do not directly produce food, but they reinforce cohesion, hope, and collective action. Shared rituals remind villagers of mutual dependence and provide structure in an unpredictable environment. Religion and practical survival strategies work in tandem, creating a framework for both physical and emotional endurance. Yet amid all these adaptations, you are left with a pressing question. How do communities maintain cohesion, culture, and identity when hunger is relentless? How do ordinary people manage to preserve hope, relationships, and social networks while facing repeated crises that threaten both body and society? And perhaps most importantly, what long-term effects do repeated famines have on behavior, social organization, and the strategies passed down to future generations? The medieval famine demonstrates that survival is far more than endurance. It is strategy, ingenuity, and social cooperation. Ordinary people navigate scarcity through observation, experimentation, and shared knowledge, preserving life even when circumstances seem insurmountable. In these small, persistent acts, rationing food, cultivating hidden plots, sharing labor, and caring for the vulnerable communities endure, leaving a legacy of resilience that outlives the immediate crisis. The famine finally begins to ease, but its impact is far from over. Fields slowly recover, grain stores are replenished, and livestock numbers begin to rise. Yet you realize that survival was never merely a matter of waiting for rain or better harvests. It was built on ingenuity, observation, and the persistent adaptation of everyday life. The strategies you and your neighbors developed, rationing, foraging, sharing resources, have become second nature, woven into the rhythms of survival. You notice the long-term effects of scarcity on communities. Villages have been depopulated, some abandoned entirely, while survivors carry both physical and psychological scars. Mortality has reduced labor capacity, altered social hierarchies, and forced households to reorganize. Families consolidate, skills are redistributed, and knowledge about sustainable practices becomes central to daily life. Even after the immediate crisis ends, the lessons learned continue to shape how communities cultivate land, allocate resources, and maintain social bonds. Resource management, once a temporary survival strategy, now becomes a permanent part of village life. Granaries are improved, hidden caches maintained, and food preservation techniques refined. You observe that ordinary people, farmers, laborers, and household heads develop nuanced knowledge of crop rotation, seed selection, and seasonal cycles, often passed down orally or through apprenticeship. These practices, born from necessity, increase long-term resilience and provide a foundation for future generations to navigate uncertainty. Social cooperation has been tested and strengthened. Villages that survived relied on mutual aid, collective labor, and shared knowledge. You see that survival depended not only on individual ingenuity, but on networks of support. Neighbors watching over each other's fields, families sharing food, and communities organizing labor to ensure everyone could survive. The famine reinforces the importance of social cohesion, teaching lessons that outlast the immediate crisis. Trust, reciprocity, and negotiation become embedded in social norms. You also notice subtle shifts in power and social structure. With depopulation and labor scarcity, peasants sometimes gain leverage in negotiating rents or obligations, while local lords must adapt to the reduced workforce. These changes are incremental but significant, showing that even the most marginalized individuals influence the broader trajectory of their society. Survival is never solely about enduring scarcity. It is about learning to navigate social hierarchies, relationships, and obligations in ways that preserve life and continuity. Children who survive the famine carry forward essential knowledge. They learn from parents, grandparents, and neighbors how to recognize edible plants, manage scarce resources, and prepare for lean seasons. They inherit both practical skills and behavioral strategies, patience, observation, and prudence. This intergenerational transfer of knowledge ensures that survival strategies become embedded in the culture, shaping decisions, values, and responses to future crises. Religion and ritual continue to shape recovery. Processions, prayers, and community rites mark the passing of the famine, reinforcing shared memory and collective resilience. Faith provides psychological reassurance, reinforces social cohesion, and validates the endurance and ingenuity of ordinary people. Communities integrate spiritual and practical strategies, understanding that survival is as much a matter of morale and social order as it is of food and water. Even as the immediate threat of famine passes, the psychological effects linger. Families remain cautious with resources, habits of observation and prudence become ingrained, and children grow up with heightened awareness of scarcity. You notice that these experiences cultivate resilience, shaping not only survival during crises, but also the everyday behaviors and decision-making of entire communities. The famine leaves lessons in endurance, cooperation, and adaptation that outlive the crisis itself. And yet, as you survey the recovering fields and villages, a lingering question remains. How do societies remember scarcity, suffering, and survival? How are these lessons transmitted, formalized, or forgotten? What impact do repeated famines have on values, behaviors, and long-term societal resilience? You realize that the survival strategies, knowledge, and social adaptations cultivated during famine are quietly woven into the fabric of society, influencing generations long after the soil has recovered and the immediate hunger has passed. Ultimately, the medieval famine teaches a profound truth about human endurance. Survival is a combination of practical skill, social cooperation, adaptability, and psychological resilience. Ordinary people, farmers, laborers, children, and elders, navigate scarcity not through heroism or wealth, but through persistent observation, experimentation, and mutual support. The lessons of famine endure not in chronicles of kings or battles, but in the daily rhythms, practices, and social networks that allow communities to survive adversity. History is shaped not only by catastrophes, but by the quiet ingenuity and resilience of ordinary lives. The famine leaves behind a legacy of survival strategies, knowledge, and social cohesion that extends far beyond the immediate crisis. And as you reflect, it becomes clear that human endurance, collective adaptation, and shared ingenuity are as vital to history as armies, treaties, and crowns, proving that even in the harshest of circumstances, ordinary people define the resilience and continuity of society itself. Story 7. The brutality of medieval punishments. You step onto a narrow dirt track that winds through forests, hills, and open fields. The year is 1380, and you are traveling from one village to another to deliver goods, visit relatives, or seek work. Travel is not easy. Roads are poorly maintained, bridges often broken, and travelers face threats from wild animals, bandits, and harsh weather. Unlike modern highways, medieval roads are fragile lifelines connecting scattered communities, and every journey requires preparation, vigilance, and a clear understanding of both geography and social risks. Merchants, pilgrims, and laborers share the roads, each with different objectives and risks. You notice that caravans and groups travel together whenever possible, understanding that strength in numbers reduces vulnerability to attack. Pack animals carry goods, grain, cloth, tools, or livestock, while travelers keep weapons at hand, swords, knives, or clubs, not to seek conflict but to survive sudden encounters with bandits. Travel is not a leisurely activity. It is a strategic enterprise requiring foresight, skill, and constant attention. Villages and inns along the route are crucial for rest and resupply. You stop at a way station, noting the smell of smoke from cooking fires, the clatter of carts, and the chatter of weary travelers. Inns vary in quality. Some offer food, shelter, and stabling for animals, while others are little more than open barns where theft and disease are constant threats. You learn quickly that choosing where to stop can mean the difference between safety and danger, comfort and illness, survival and misfortune. The risk of banditry is ever present. Forests, hills, and isolated stretches of road hide thieves who prey on travelers with goods or coin. You notice that travelers adopt multiple strategies, traveling in groups, avoiding night travel, and using known safe paths marked by villages or patrols. Even with careful planning, encounters are unpredictable. Stories circulate of entire caravans ambushed, wagons looted, and travelers left for dead. Survival depends on a mixture of preparation, vigilance, and luck. Weather adds another layer of difficulty. Muddy roads in spring, flooded streams, and winter snows slow progress and endanger both people and animals. You carry extra provisions, waterproof coverings, and tools to navigate obstacles. Travel is slower and more taxing than modern roads suggest, with exhaustion, injury, and exposure constant companions. You begin to understand that the journey itself is as challenging as the destination. Trade is a critical reason for travel, yet it brings both opportunity and risk. Merchants move goods between towns and markets, negotiating prices, quality, and access. You observe the careful planning required, knowledge of seasonal demand, the safest routes, and relationships with local lords or toll collectors. Success depends on intelligence, timing, and social skill as much as on physical endurance. A single misjudgment can result in lost goods, confiscation, or violence. Travel also facilitates the exchange of information. News, political rumors, and cultural practices spread along these routes, connecting otherwise isolated communities. You hear stories from distant towns, learn new techniques for farming or weaving, and gain knowledge of markets far from home. Roads are not merely physical spaces, they are channels for communication, commerce, and cultural transmission. Yet the movement of information mirrors the movement of people, uneven, slow, and often risky. Disease is another hidden danger of travel. Crowded inns, shared food and water, and contact with strangers increase the risk of infection. You notice travelers taking precautions, carrying personal utensils, avoiding contact with the sick, and carefully selecting where to rest. Even these measures provide limited protection, reminding you that risk is a constant companion on the medieval road. Social etiquette and local customs affect safety and success. You must be aware of local lords, territories, toll obligations, and community norms. Failing to respect these rules can provoke hostility, fines, or even violence. Survival and success on the road require both physical preparation and social intelligence. Observing, negotiating, and adapting to each village or region you pass through. Yet amid all these hazards, travel is also a source of opportunity, autonomy, and agency. The roads connect communities, enable trade, and allow people to expand their horizons beyond the village. Every successful journey is a testament to planning, observation, and endurance. Each mile traveled safely reinforces knowledge, skill, and confidence, gradually forming a culture of adaptation that allows individuals and communities to navigate a dangerous and unpredictable world. And still, as you prepare to continue your journey into the forested hills ahead, a question remains. How do ordinary people maintain safety, resources, and social cohesion while navigating such a perilous network of roads and obligations? How do travel, trade, and risk shape not only survival but the culture, knowledge, and resilience of medieval society? These questions linger, hinting that the story of the road is as much about human ingenuity and social adaptation as it is about carts, horses, and dirt paths. As you continue along the medieval roads, you quickly realize that each journey is a delicate balance between opportunity and danger. Survival depends not only on physical preparation, but also on social awareness, strategic thinking, and a constant understanding of risk. Roads are lifelines, connecting villages, markets, and towns, but they are also conduits for violence, disease, and exploitation. You learn that travel in the Middle Ages is less about speed and more about vigilance, observation, and adaptability. Groups of travelers form naturally as a survival strategy. Solo movement is rarely safe, particularly for those carrying valuable goods. Merchants, pilgrims, laborers, and even stray herders band together, sharing knowledge of terrain, local authorities, and seasonal hazards. These traveling groups develop informal hierarchies, leaders who know the roads, negotiators who manage tolls and interactions with lords, and lookouts who monitor for bandits. Every journey becomes a cooperative enterprise, where survival depends on coordination, trust, and clear communication. Trade provides motivation but also increases risk. You notice merchants carefully planning routes based on seasonal conditions, toll schedules, and local political climates. Markets in distant towns are often the only place to sell goods for profit, yet reaching them requires negotiating forests, hills, rivers, and unstable political borders. Success depends on knowledge of demand, timing, and alliances with local authorities or guilds. One miscalculation, an impassable road, an overzealous toll collector, or a sudden skirmish can undo months of labor and planning. Banditry is a constant threat. You observe that attackers exploit both the terrain and gaps in patrols, preying on isolated travelers or small groups. To survive, you must remain alert, scouting ahead, avoiding predictable routes, and hiding valuable goods. You see travelers using decoy packs, traveling at dawn or dusk, and forming rotating watches to reduce vulnerability. Even with careful preparation, encounters are unpredictable. Survival requires a combination of foresight, speed, and the willingness to make quick, sometimes risky decisions. Weather compounds the challenge. Heavy rains turn dirt roads into mud, freezing winters make travel treacherous, and sudden storms threaten both people and animals. You learn to interpret cloud patterns, river conditions, and seasonal changes to anticipate delays. Roads themselves are fragile infrastructure, often requiring repair, fording, or detours. Survival depends on physical endurance, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to constantly changing conditions. Disease remains an invisible but deadly companion. Travelers share water, food, and shelter, increasing the risk of illness. Epidemics travel along these routes as easily as merchants and pilgrims. You notice that travelers adopt informal hygiene practices, separating food, cleaning wounds, and monitoring companions' health to minimize risk. Even with these precautions, sickness is unpredictable, reminding you that the road itself is a space where life and death intersect continuously. Social awareness is crucial. Every village, town, or toll station comes with its own customs, regulations, and potential hazards. Local lords often control road access, levy tolls, or demand labor, while communities impose informal norms of etiquette and reciprocity. You must read the situation carefully. Failing to comply with local expectations can provoke hostility, fines, or violence. The road is not simply a physical space. It is a network of social contracts, relationships, and local knowledge that travelers must navigate as carefully as they navigate rivers or forests. Despite these challenges, travel also enables exchange, growth, and opportunity. Roads allow information, goods, and skills to circulate. You hear news from distant regions, learn new techniques, and develop relationships with other communities. The journey is an education in observation, negotiation, and resilience. Each successful trip strengthens your knowledge of terrain, people, and survival strategies, gradually forming a culture of adaptability among travelers and communities alike. You notice that adaptation is iterative. Groups adjust routes, timing, and social strategies based on prior experience. Knowledge accumulates slowly. Which inns are safe, which toll collectors are lenient, where bandits are most likely to strike, which fords are passable. Survival is a product of collective memory and careful observation. Communities that maintain these networks of knowledge thrive, while those who ignore lessons from previous journeys often suffer. Yet, as you progress along winding roads and precarious paths, a question lingers. How do people balance the constant tension between risk and reward? How do travel, trade, and social negotiations shape not only survival but the development of knowledge, culture, and community cohesion? You realize that the roads are more than physical conduits, they are crucibles of human ingenuity, shaping behavior, relationships, and the resilience of entire societies. The medieval road is a place of challenge, opportunity, and adaptation. Ordinary travelers survive not through luck alone, but through observation, cooperation, and strategic thinking. Every journey is an exercise in endurance, social intelligence, and practical problem solving, demonstrating that the fabric of society is maintained as much by those who move, observe, and adapt along the roads as by those who rule from castles and towns. The journey finally brings you to a bustling market town, the destination of your long trek along muddy, uneven, and dangerous roads. You notice the energy in the streets, merchants selling wares from distant regions, travelers exchanging news, and artisans displaying tools and crafts. This town exists because of the road's arteries that connect people, ideas, and goods. Yet you also understand that every mile traveled has demanded vigilance, skill, and adaptation, making survival itself an achievement of endurance and ingenuity. Travel has reshaped communities in subtle ways. Villages along major routes often prosper, offering food, lodging, and services to travelers. Inns, stables, and workshops emerge as centers of economic activity. Local farmers gain access to broader markets, selling surplus crops and goods while acquiring products they cannot produce themselves. The road is more than a path. It is a conduit for economic growth, social interaction, and cultural exchange. Ordinary people, through travel and trade, influence the prosperity and resilience of entire regions. You notice that knowledge flows along these routes as much as goods. Techniques for farming, weaving, brewing, and metalworking travel with merchants and laborers, spreading innovations that would otherwise remain isolated. Even survival strategies, how to navigate bandit-prone forests, for example, or which herbal remedies are effective, are communicated orally among travelers. Roads are not merely physical spaces, but networks of information, shaping the collective expertise and adaptability of communities over time. Risk and social negotiation remain constant. Travelers must respect local customs, tolls, and the authority of lords, balancing compliance with practical survival. Failure to observe these rules can result in fines, confiscation of goods, or violence. Yet the necessity of negotiation fosters skills in diplomacy, observation, and decision-making. You realize that ordinary people, peasants, laborers, and merchants, become adept at navigating complex social and political landscapes, learning to anticipate threats and leverage opportunities in ways that shape both personal survival and broader social dynamics. Travel also exposes communities to vulnerability. Epidemics, banditry, and supply shortages spread along roads as easily as news and goods. Villages that are poorly connected or that fail to observe lessons from prior journeys often suffer disproportionately. Survival, therefore, is not merely an individual effort but a collective enterprise. Those who maintain networks, share knowledge, and organize defenses are more likely to endure. The road is both a lifeline and a crucible, teaching lessons about cooperation, vigilance, and adaptation that outlast any single journey. Children and apprentices traveling with families or caravans gain critical experience. They learn to recognize terrain hazards, negotiate social obligations, and observe patterns in human behavior. Each journey becomes a training ground for practical intelligence, endurance, and social acumen. You notice that these lessons embedded in the lived experience of travel are as significant as any formal education. Survival strategies, social negotiation, and observational skills are passed down through generations, shaping behavior, culture, and resilience over time. Even the smallest interactions along the road can leave lasting impacts. A merchant's generosity, a neighbor's warning, or a traveler's shared knowledge may mean the difference between survival and disaster. Ordinary people shape the functioning of the network through these countless micro-decisions, demonstrating that history is not only written by rulers or warriors, but by those who move, observe, and adapt in the spaces between. Roads are alive with human ingenuity, collaboration, and persistence. Religion continues to intertwine with travel. Pilgrimages, Prayers for protection and rituals at shrines or roadside chapels reinforce hope and social cohesion. Faith provides psychological support, moral guidance, and a sense of purpose during long and dangerous journeys. These practices help travelers endure not only physical challenges, but also the uncertainty and anxiety inherent in life on medieval roads. Ultimately, the medieval road is both a physical and social ecosystem. It is a site of risk, opportunity, adaptation, and learning. Ordinary people, merchants, pilgrims, laborers, and families navigate this ecosystem through observation, strategic planning, and cooperation. Survival on the road depends on vigilance, resourcefulness, and social intelligence. And as you reach your destination, you understand that these journeys, repeated countless times, quietly shape the economy, knowledge, culture, and resilience of medieval society. And yet, a final thought remains. How do the lessons learned on the road, vigilance, negotiation, adaptability, ripple outward to shape entire communities and generations? How much of the structure, knowledge, and culture of medieval life owes itself to the movement, observation, and ingenuity of ordinary travelers? The roads are more than paths between villages. They are arteries through which survival, knowledge, and resilience flow, silently molding the course of history. Story 8: The Viking Raids and the Collapse of Coastal Communities. You find yourself in a small medieval town where the market square is bustling with merchants, peasants, and travelers. Signs of authority are visible but sparse. A few armed guards patrol intermittently, a magistrate's office sits near the church, and public notices detail fines, punishments, and local ordinances. You quickly realize that law and order are fragile constructs. Justice exists, but enforcement is uneven. Punishments harsh, and survival often depends on understanding both the letter of the law and the social power structures that underpin it. Crime is surprisingly common. Theft, poaching, assault, and even fraud occur frequently in towns, villages, and along roads. You notice that people live with a constant awareness of risk, keeping food, money, and livestock secure, forming alliances with neighbors, and observing local customs closely. Survival often depends less on moral conduct than on practical strategies to avoid becoming a victim. You begin to understand that medieval society is built on both formal law and informal social negotiation. Both are necessary to navigate daily life safely. Punishments are public and severe. Thieves might be flogged, branded, or hanged, debtors imprisoned, and those accused of blasphemy or heresy subjected to ritual humiliation or worse. You notice that public punishment serves multiple purposes. It deters others, reinforces social norms, and asserts the authority of lords, church officials, or magistrates. Yet these measures are inconsistent. Enforcement depends heavily on local officials, political priorities, and available resources. A wealthy or connected individual might escape punishment entirely, while the poor often bear the full weight of justice. Community surveillance is critical. Villagers, merchants, and travelers act as informal enforcers, observing suspicious behavior, reporting offenses, and sometimes administering immediate consequences. You see that social networks are a key element of law. Families watch over each other, neighbors intervene when disputes arise, and reputation can protect or endanger an individual. Survival requires an acute understanding of who is trustworthy, who has authority, and how the social fabric operates. Debt and economic survival are major drivers of criminal behavior. Families and laborers often face scarcity, fines, or unpaid obligations that threaten their livelihoods. You observe desperate acts, theft of grain, poaching from common lands, or falsifying transactions. These actions are not merely moral failings, they are practical responses to material necessity. In many cases, the law punishes survival strategies more harshly than actual malice, highlighting the precarious balance between authority and subsistence. Conflict resolution is often local and immediate. Disputes over land, labor, or livestock are sometimes settled through negotiation, mediation, or payment of fines rather than formal trials. You notice that local customs, oral agreements, customary rights, and village councils often take precedence over official law. Survival depends on knowing these customs, adhering to social norms, and understanding which authorities will enforce which rules. Knowledge of local practices becomes as critical as physical strength or cunning. Crime and punishment are intertwined with hierarchy. Lords, clergy, and wealthy merchants wield disproportionate influence, shaping what is punishable and how justice is applied. You observe that those with social power can manipulate legal outcomes, while ordinary villagers often rely on negotiation, alliances, and prudence to protect themselves. Survival involves constantly assessing power dynamics and understanding when to comply, when to negotiate, and when to avoid confrontation entirely. Public executions, stocks, and pillories serve both as deterrents and as spectacles. You witness crowds gathering to observe a thief's punishment or a debt defaulter humiliated. These events are not only about law enforcement, they reinforce social order, community values, and collective memory. Ordinary people learn lessons not only from reading notices or hearing rumors, but by witnessing punishment firsthand, internalizing the consequences of transgression. Religion and morality are deeply intertwined with justice. Church courts adjudicate moral offenses, heresy, and marriage disputes, often using confession, penance, or excommunication rather than corporal punishment. You notice that survival requires navigating both secular and ecclesiastical systems, understanding when to appeal to one authority or another. Legal pluralism, multiple overlapping systems of law, creates a complex environment where knowledge, observation, and alliances are essential for safety. Yet, as you observe daily life in this system of uneven justice, a question emerges. How do ordinary people endure, adapt, and survive in a world where punishment is arbitrary, authority is inconsistent, and social status can determine outcomes? How do communities maintain cohesion and mutual trust when fear of law or the powerful pervades everyday life? The answers lie not in heroic defiance or formal statutes, but in the subtle strategies, knowledge, and social intelligence cultivated by those navigating this precarious world. Medieval crime and punishment reveal a society in which survival requires constant observation, negotiation, and adaptation. Ordinary people are active participants in maintaining social order, protecting themselves, and mediating disputes. Justice is not only a system of rules, but a lived experience of relationships, vigilance, and practical ingenuity, showing that in the Middle Ages, survival depended as much on social skill as on strength or moral conduct. You now see the medieval justice system not as an abstract set of rules, but as a living, unpredictable network that affects every decision you make. Survival is inseparable from social awareness. Every interaction, buying food, borrowing tools, or walking along the market street, requires careful judgment about who has authority, who can be trusted, and when negotiation or discretion is necessary. You begin to understand that knowledge of local customs, power hierarchies, and human behavior is just as crucial as physical strength or skill with a weapon. Economic pressure is a constant driver of conflict. Debts, taxes, rents, and fines create a delicate balancing act. You observe that some villagers pay what they can to avoid legal repercussions, while others skirt obligations, hiding resources or negotiating partial payments. Survival involves a combination of prudence, cunning, and strategic relationships. Even small miscalculations, underestimating a toll collector or overestimating a neighbor's generosity, can result in fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. Every financial decision is intertwined with the risk of punishment. Communities develop informal systems to mitigate these risks. Families watch over each other's property, neighbors warn of potential threats, and local councils mediate disputes before they escalate to formal courts. You notice that reputation plays a central role. A person known for fairness, honesty, or reliability can navigate disputes more successfully, while those perceived as deceitful or aggressive attract legal scrutiny or social ostracism. Survival is deeply social, depending on networks of trust, reciprocity, and observation. Crime itself is often a practical response to scarcity. Theft, poaching, and fraud are strategies for survival rather than rebellion. You observe peasants taking small amounts of grain from common lands to feed their children, laborers forging documents to secure payment, or travelers bartering goods creatively to avoid penalties. Punishment may be swift and harsh, but these acts reveal the ingenuity and adaptability of ordinary people responding to material necessity. You realize that survival often depends on carefully weighing risk and reward, and learning when to bend the rules without provoking lethal consequences. Travelers and outsiders face particular challenges. You notice that those unfamiliar with local customs, merchants, pilgrims, or laborers must learn quickly or risk severe punishment. Information about tolls, territorial authority, and community norms is highly valuable. Travelers develop strategies, hearing guides, joining groups, and observing local interactions before engaging. Survival involves both observation and improvisation, requiring flexibility and social intelligence. Punishments, though harsh, serve practical social functions. Public executions, floggings, or pillorying are intended to deter wrongdoing and reinforce hierarchy. You observe that these spectacles, while frightening, also teach lessons: which behaviors are unacceptable, who holds authority, and how far enforcement reaches. Ordinary people internalize these lessons through observation and experience, subtly shaping behavior and expectations. Survival involves understanding and navigating these cues carefully, balancing fear with pragmatism. Religion and moral oversight are intertwined with secular enforcement. Church courts address offenses ranging from blasphemy to marital disputes, often relying on confession, penance, or symbolic punishment rather than physical coercion. You notice that navigating overlapping secular and ecclesiastical jurisdictions requires subtlety and strategy. Knowing which court to appeal to, whom to bribe or persuade, and when to comply or resist becomes a vital skill. Survival is not passive, it is active negotiation in a complex, multi-layered system. Even seemingly minor interactions carry risk. Borrowing a neighbor's tools, negotiating a market price, or disputing a small fine requires careful observation of authority, reputation, and social norms. Misreading a situation can escalate into conflict or legal consequences. Ordinary people develop an acute sensitivity to social cues, understanding that survival is as much about perception, communication, and timing as it is about strength or skill. At the same time, you notice remarkable resilience and adaptability. Families and communities maintain cohesion, support vulnerable members, and develop strategies to navigate legal and social hazards. These survival strategies, observation, negotiation, social alliances, and incremental learning, are passed down through generations, forming an invisible infrastructure that allows communities to endure, even when laws are arbitrary or enforcement inconsistent. Yet, as you witness daily life under this precarious system, a question arises: how do ordinary people sustain cohesion, trust, and community when the threat of punishment is constant and authority is unpredictable? How do survival strategies, social networks, and adaptive knowledge persist when the law is capricious and the powerful often arbitrary? These questions hint at a deeper truth. Medieval justice is not only about law and order, but about the subtle, constant strategies through which ordinary people navigate risk, maintain cohesion, and survive. Medieval crime and punishment reveal that survival is an active practice. Ordinary people are not passive victims of harsh laws, they are skilled observers, negotiators, and strategists. They adapt to scarcity, navigate risk, and maintain social order through subtle, learned behaviors. The system itself, uneven and often arbitrary, shapes culture, social intelligence, and resilience, showing that survival depends as much on perception, cooperation, and strategy as on physical endurance or moral behavior. The market square is quieter now as the day wanes, yet the echoes of earlier conflicts, disputes, and punishments linger. You notice the subtle ways ordinary people navigate a system of uneven enforcement, harsh punishment, and overlapping authorities. Survival is less about defying law and more about observation, adaptation, and strategic social interaction. You realize that the medieval justice system, with all its brutality and inconsistency, shapes behavior, relationships, and social intelligence as much as it enforces morality. Families and communities develop systems to mitigate risk. Neighbors watch each other's property, lend labor or tools, and share information about local authorities and disputes. Reputation becomes a powerful protective mechanism. Someone known for honesty, reliability, or prudence is less likely to be accused falsely or targeted. Survival depends on carefully managing relationships, observing social cues, and understanding the subtle balance between compliance and strategic negotiation. Ordinary people learn to navigate this system intuitively, developing skills that are as essential as any legal code. Punishments, though often public and severe, serve as lessons. You see villagers internalizing consequences, adjusting behavior, and transmitting knowledge to children and apprentices. Flogging, pillorying, and public humiliation communicate not just the authority of lords or magistrates, but also the boundaries of acceptable behavior within the community. Observing these events teaches survival strategies, from avoiding minor offenses to negotiating disputes before they escalate. Experience becomes the primary teacher, and practical knowledge often outweighs formal instruction in navigating law. Crime itself is contextual. Many offenses, poaching, theft, or minor forgery, are responses to scarcity, poverty, or survival necessity. You notice that the law often punishes necessity disproportionately, reflecting both social hierarchy and the interests of the powerful. Yet ordinary people are resourceful. They develop methods to evade detection, appeal to local customs, or negotiate leniency. Survival is a blend of prudence, cunning, and observation, and those who master these skills are more likely to endure, maintain reputation, and protect family and community. Travelers and outsiders encounter particular challenges. They must navigate unfamiliar jurisdictions, respect local customs, and negotiate interactions with authorities whose priorities they do not fully understand. Knowledge of these social landscapes is often more important than physical preparedness. You observe that successful travelers, merchants, pilgrims, or laborers develop strategies for blending in, seeking guidance, and building alliances along the road. Ordinary people become experts in social navigation, balancing compliance, negotiation, and observation to survive. Church courts, moral oversight, and overlapping jurisdictions add layers of complexity. Survival requires understanding which authority to appeal to, which customs take precedence, and when compromise or concealment is safer than confrontation. Ordinary people develop nuanced strategies to navigate these systems, preserving autonomy while avoiding harsh punishment. The interplay between secular and ecclesiastical law fosters subtlety, negotiation, and strategic thinking as essential skills for survival. Even small interactions carry risk. Borrowing tools, negotiating market prices, or disputing minor fines requires careful observation of power, reputation, and context. Survival depends on sensitivity to social cues, timing, and the ability to anticipate consequences. You notice that ordinary people cultivate these skills not as formal training, but through experience, observation, and practical necessity. Life in a system of uneven justice is a constant exercise in social intelligence. Yet despite the dangers, communities endure. Families protect one another, share knowledge, and maintain cohesion. Ordinary people negotiate risk collectively, creating networks of trust, reciprocity, and adaptation. Survival depends not only on avoiding punishment, but also on preserving social order and mutual support. These strategies, built on observation, ingenuity, and cooperation, become part of the fabric of medieval society, ensuring continuity across generations even under harsh legal regimes. As you reflect, a question arises. How much of medieval culture, behavior, and social intelligence was shaped by the everyday negotiation of law and authority? How did ordinary people internalize lessons from punishment, scarcity, and hierarchy to develop adaptive skills that sustained families and communities over generations? You begin to understand that survival was not passive, it was active, requiring observation, strategy, and the quiet cultivation of knowledge that outlived any single ruler or statute. Medieval crime and punishment reveal a society where resilience and survival depend on social intelligence as much as physical strength. Ordinary people, villagers, laborers, merchants, and travelers navigate risk, maintain cohesion, and preserve continuity in the face of arbitrary authority and harsh consequences. Their strategies, cooperation, observation, negotiation, and adaptability, form the hidden infrastructure of society, quietly shaping culture, knowledge, and human resilience. Ultimately, the lessons of law, punishment, and social survival extend far beyond individual offenses. They demonstrate how ordinary people endure, adapt, and influence the structures around them. Survival under medieval justice is a testament not to heroism, but to the ingenuity, observation, and strategic intelligence of everyday life, a reminder that the persistence of society relies as much on ordinary resilience as on rulers, laws, or armies. Story 9: The 100 Years' War, a generation lost. You step into a small, dimly lit classroom in a monastery in the year 1200. The walls are bare, the wooden benches hard, and the only light comes from a few narrow windows and flickering candles. Outside, the village bustles with the sounds of labor, carts, livestock, and the distant clatter of blacksmiths. Inside, a handful of boys and young men sit quietly, copying texts by hand or reciting prayers. Education is a rare and precious resource, limited to the clergy, the wealthy, and a few ambitious townsfolk. You quickly realize that literacy and learning are not merely academic pursuits, they are tools for survival, mobility, and influence in a world dominated by labor, scarcity, and hierarchical power. Schools are few and highly selective. Monasteries and cathedral schools dominate learning, focusing primarily on reading, writing, Latin, and religious instruction. You notice that lessons are repetitive, slow, and laborious. Memorization, copying manuscripts, and chanting prayers. Success depends on discipline, observation, and endurance. The process is arduous, but those who persist gain skills that open doors, roles in administration, clerical work, and positions of relative influence that are otherwise inaccessible. Education is survival through knowledge, a path to opportunity amid rigid social structures. Most ordinary children never enter formal schools. Their education is practical and experiential, learning farming techniques, animal husbandry, craft skills, and social norms. You observe that these forms of learning are equally crucial for survival. A peasant child who can identify edible plants, repair tools, or navigate local power structures is better equipped to endure scarcity, disease, and social challenges. Knowledge, in all its forms, is a tool to manage risk and maintain life. Books are rare, expensive, and labor-intensive to produce. You watch scribes painstakingly copying manuscripts with quills and ink, each letter formed carefully on parchment. A single book may take months to complete. This scarcity makes literacy a form of power. Those who can read and write control access to religious, legal, and administrative knowledge. You realize that education is not merely intellectual, it is an investment in influence, survival, and social mobility. Knowledge is currency in a society where physical labor dominates daily life. The curriculum emphasizes Latin and religious texts, but practical knowledge seeps in indirectly. You notice that students learn logic, memory, and analytical skills through study of scripture and classical works. These mental exercises foster discipline, observation, and strategic thinking skills that can be applied beyond the classroom. Education cultivates not only literacy, but adaptability. A mind trained to observe, analyze, and reason is better equipped to navigate the uncertainties of medieval life. Outside monasteries and formal schools, apprenticeships provide another path to learning. A young blacksmith, carpenter, or tailor acquires skills by observing, imitating, and working under a master. You see that survival, in both physical and social terms, depends on mastery of craft. Apprentices learn practical skills, understand social hierarchies, and gain access to networks of mutual support and patronage. Knowledge in this context is tangible, applied, and inseparable from daily survival. Illiteracy shapes the everyday experience of ordinary people. Legal disputes, property agreements, and market transactions often depend on intermediaries, clerks, scribes, or literate neighbors. You notice that survival requires both skill and social awareness, knowing whom to trust, how to negotiate, and when to rely on others for critical information. In this way, literacy becomes a bridge between survival and vulnerability, creating opportunities for those who possess it and risks for those who do not. Religious instruction is central. Prayers, scripture, and ritual reinforce moral norms, social order, and communal cohesion. Literacy enables access to these teachings and the ability to participate in clerical or administrative roles. For monks and nuns, literacy also enables copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge, and participating in a broader intellectual world. Learning and faith are intertwined, each reinforcing discipline, social identity, and the practicalities of daily life. Yet, despite the apparent rigidity of medieval education, knowledge is a living, adaptive resource. You notice that lessons learned memorization, observation, precision, and patience transfer to survival skills in both mundane and extraordinary circumstances. Reading and writing, craft mastery, and oral knowledge are tools for navigating scarcity, hierarchy, and danger. Education is not merely academic. It is a strategy for endurance and adaptation in a world where knowledge often determines survival. And as you leave the monastery and step back into the village streets, a question lingers. How do literacy, learning, and practical knowledge intersect to shape opportunities, social mobility, and survival in a society where danger, scarcity, and hierarchy are constant? How do ordinary people, through observation, skill, and informal learning, navigate a world in which formal education is rare but immensely powerful? These questions hint at a broader truth. Knowledge, in its many forms, is a lifeline in the Middle Ages, and survival depends as much on learning as on strength or labor. You leave the dim light of the monastery classroom and step back into the world outside. Here, survival depends on the application of knowledge as much as physical endurance. Literacy, numeracy, craft skills, and practical observation are all tools for navigating scarcity, hierarchy, and risk. You quickly realize that education is not confined to formal institutions. It extends into daily life, apprenticeships, family teaching, and communal practice. Ordinary people learn by doing, watching, and adapting, and these skills are as crucial as reading or writing for enduring the hardships of medieval life. Apprenticeships are central to skill transmission. A young boy working under a blacksmith or carpenter learns not only the trade itself, but also discipline, patience, and problem-solving. You notice that mastering a craft requires observation, repetition, and innovation. A mistake in forging a tool, repairing a roof, or tending livestock could be costly, and so attention to detail becomes a form of survival. Knowledge is embedded in practice, and practical intelligence becomes as valuable as theoretical learning. Commerce and trade are another arena where literacy and numeracy intersect with survival. Merchants, market traders, and tax collectors rely on arithmetic, record keeping, and knowledge of contracts to operate successfully. You watch a clerk tallying sales and debts, carefully tracking each transaction to prevent loss or fraud. Ordinary people who develop even modest numeracy skills can navigate markets more effectively, avoid exploitation, and plan for scarcity. Learning, in this sense, directly impacts both daily sustenance and long-term opportunity. Observation and oral knowledge are equally vital. Farmers memorize seasonal patterns, weather cues, and ecological signals to optimize planting, harvesting, and foraging. Healers, midwives, and herbalists acquire practical knowledge about medicinal plants, treatments, and human anatomy through experience and mentorship. You notice that these skills are often unrecorded yet critical to survival, forming a network of practical intelligence that underpins communities. Knowledge circulates informally, transmitted through storytelling, apprenticeship, and daily observation. Social navigation is another dimension of survival. Understanding hierarchies, obligations, and etiquette can prevent conflict, exploitation, or legal trouble. You observe that even illiterate villagers develop a keen sense of authority, negotiation, and local customs. They know when to defer, when to appeal, and when to rely on alliances with neighbors or patrons. Survival is not only physical but social. The ability to interpret behavior, anticipate reactions, and communicate effectively is essential for enduring scarcity, disease, and hierarchical pressures. Religion remains deeply intertwined with education. Literacy enables access to scripture, prayer, and ritual, while moral instruction reinforces social norms, ethics, and community cohesion. You notice that religious knowledge functions both practically and psychologically. It structures daily life, shapes behavior, and provides a framework for understanding misfortune, danger, and scarcity. Education in this sense is inseparable from faith, social order, and survival strategy. Women's education, while often informal, is equally vital. Mothers and grandmothers teach children practical skills: cooking, preserving food, weaving, tending animals, and basic health care. These lessons are critical for family survival. You notice that women transmit both practical knowledge and social intelligence, ensuring that survival strategies are embedded within households and passed to the next generation. Literacy is not always the measure of influence. Practical skill and social understanding are equally crucial. Even in moments of crisis, harvest failure, disease outbreak, or political instability, knowledge becomes a survival tool. Farmers apply learned patterns from previous years, craftsmen improvise repairs, and villagers negotiate with authorities to protect their resources. Education, in its broadest sense, is a living, adaptive practice that allows communities to endure and adapt. The ability to observe, plan, and act based on knowledge often determines whether families survive or perish. Yet, as you reflect on the range of learning, from formal schooling to oral instruction, a question emerges. How do different forms of knowledge, literacy, apprenticeship, observation, and communal memory interact to shape survival and opportunity? How do ordinary people leverage limited access to education to navigate danger, scarcity, and social hierarchy? These questions highlight a subtle truth. In the Middle Ages, the ability to acquire, apply, and transmit knowledge was as critical as any physical skill or material resource. Education, literacy, and practical knowledge in the medieval world are not luxuries, they are survival tools. Ordinary people navigate the challenges of scarcity, hierarchy, and risk through observation, apprenticeship, and social intelligence. Knowledge becomes a form of power, a resource, and a strategy, allowing communities to endure hardships, preserve culture, and pass adaptive skills to future generations. Survival depends as much on the mind as on the body, showing that learning in all its forms is inseparable from the endurance of medieval life. The classroom walls fade as you return to the broader medieval world, where survival is shaped by a delicate interplay of skill, observation, and social intelligence. You notice that education, formal and informal, has enduring consequences beyond reading and writing. It determines who can navigate the complexities of law, trade, religion, and community life. Knowledge becomes a survival tool, a form of currency, and a framework for understanding the world in the absence of reliable infrastructure, consistent authority, or abundant resources. Formal schooling remains rare, but those who attend gain significant advantages. Monks, scribes, and clerks acquire literacy in Latin, the language of administration, religion, and scholarship. You observe that these skills open access to positions of relative influence, managing estates, recording taxes, or advising local lords. Education allows individuals to mediate between the powerful and ordinary people, creating opportunities for both social mobility and survival. A scribe's pen can become as potent a tool as any sword, shaping both individual fortune and community stability. Practical learning extends far beyond the monastery. Apprenticeships, familial instruction, and community mentorship transmit craft skills, survival strategies, and social intelligence. You notice that a skilled blacksmith, weaver, or healer commands respect, security, and the ability to sustain a household. Observation, repetition, and incremental experimentation allow ordinary people to adapt to changing conditions, crop failures, market fluctuations, or local conflicts. Knowledge, in its applied form, becomes an invisible infrastructure supporting both daily life and long-term resilience. Literacy and numeracy intersect with survival in everyday contexts. Merchants keep accounts, farmers calculate yields, and artisans track production and sales. These skills reduce vulnerability to theft, mismanagement, or legal disputes. You see that education, even partial or informal, enhances agency and choice, allowing individuals to negotiate with authorities, protect resources, and plan for scarcity. Survival in the Middle Ages is as much mental as physical. The ability to read, calculate, or remember patterns directly impacts the chances of endurance. Oral knowledge, too, is crucial. Families memorize seasonal cycles, ecological patterns, and herbal remedies. Communities